Hi, everyone, and welcome to the free Assange online vigil series. My name is Taylor Hudak, and I'm joined by my co-hosts Andrew Smith, Christy Doth, and Steve Poikinen. Now, today is a special episode on Saturday. Like we said in the previous vigil, we will start to hold some additional vigils as this full extradition hearing approaches. But we are joined first by a very special guest, Mohammed El-Mazi. Mohammed is a UK-based journalist and contributor to numerous outlets, including the Canary, Open Democracy, and the Greek International. That other one, I could not pronounce it, so you're going to have to do that for me, Mohammed. But thank you so much for coming on. How are you?
Thank you for having me. Yeah, that's the interregnum. It's a period in between two regimes. So it's an old
Okay.
expression. So there was a time period when Britain was briefly a republic. That too is known as the interregnum.
Okay, very interesting. Now, the full extradition hearing for Julian Assange is approaching. That will be held on Monday, February 24th. And bring awareness to this case in particular. And in fact, myself and my co-host intend on going to London to cover this, while my other two co-hosts will be in the US. So as a journalist, in your perspective, why do you support Julian Assange? And then also, what are your concerns with this case?
So I suppose those two questions, or the answers to those two questions, are interlinked, right? So I support Julian Assange precisely because of my concerns about this case. There are the idea of a publisher being criminally prosecuted for the role in publishing documents which have revealed war crimes, crimes against humanity, and other sort of waste, fraud, corruption, and criminality on the part of the state is incredibly worrying. You add to that the fact that Julian Assange is not a US person, has never signed any Official Secrets Act in relation to the United States. I know it wouldn't be called the Official Secrets Act, but any equivalent that US government employees have to sign. The fact that neither he nor WikiLeaks were based in the United States during the alleged events, or when he was involved in publishing documents, the Iraq war logs and the Afghan diaries. Just adds to the severity of the nature of the extraterritorial application of US law, because what you have is the US government claiming the right to be able to criminally prosecute a non-US person, in this case a journalist, editor, publisher, for actions that they took outside of any jurisdiction of the United States. It's quintessentially imperial in its nature, and the irony is even if you were a US citizen and you were living in Thailand and you murdered somebody and you admitted to have murdered that person and you left Thailand, the United States wouldn't be able to criminally prosecute you. No US authority could, because that would be outside of the jurisdiction of the United States. But here we have certain types of special cases. So it's about press freedom. It's about exposing war crimes and torture, yet no one is being held accountable for those crimes. Merely if we can call it being held accountable, people being held accountable are those who revealed it. I know John Kiriakou, a former CIA officer, was the only person criminally prosecuted in the United States in connection to torture committed by CIA personnel, despite the fact that he wasn't involved in the torture, merely involved in revealing the fact that it happened. So I see this very much as creating a very dangerous precedent, or continuing, if you like, expanding a very dangerous precedent of ongoing assault against press freedom. And so, yeah, that's one of the key reasons, if you like, why I can
And you know
think that the
what?
case is so
I have
important.
noticed as well. I was just at an event which was held by the Courage Foundation in DC at the National Press Club. And they had lawyers on the panel and legal experts. And they were talking about how these espionage charges really do threaten our press, or could potentially threaten our press freedoms if this case is actually tried in a US court. So of course we could talk about it all day long as journalists and our concerns, but to hear it from a legal expert really seems to put some authority behind behind these assertions here. And I've also been happy to see that there's more support for Julian that we've been seeing within recent months, and the movement seems to be getting stronger. So I want to open it up to my co-host for some questions.
People seem to perk their ears up once the legal demons get involved. Um, so it's generally a sign that we've moved from, the mere rabble or journalists trying to raise the alarm about this to, oh, now important people need to cover their ass. Um, what you were saying a moment ago about John Kiriakou, he is in fact like the second person in the history of the United States to be tried under the Espionage Act for revealing these secrets. Um, he spent, I think, a total of almost 2 years, 2.5 years in federal prison for revealing the fact that we torture people live on CNN. And he has been the only person held accountable for the US torture program in its entirety. That on its face should have people up in arms and reacting. When you are covering this, when you're writing about this, when you're going to these events and speaking to Nils Melzer as you did, which we're going to play that clip here shortly, and you can talk us through the rest of it. Is there a growing sense that more people are aware of the, I guess, to put it crudely, like the we need to cover our ass aspect of it, or higher ups within the world of journalism starting to speak of this in terms of, oh, we need to pay attention now?
Well, yeah, sure. So just on one thing in terms of Kiriakou, he ended up he was targeted officially. He pled guilty to disclosing the identity of a fellow CIA officer. And of course, that sounds much worse than it was. There was an offhand conversation a journalist has spoken to him. So he didn't think that that's what he was doing. So, and the Espionage Act, once upon a time, was used to prosecute a couple thousand people in the United States when it was first passed. But maybe we can discuss the origins of the law and its rather draconian anti-free speech beginnings, because it very much makes sense that they'd use the Espionage Act if you understand how it was first used to quell dissent against the First World War, which is why it was first passed to begin with, right? Very little to do with actual espionage. But you're correct to say that more and more establishment papers, establishment outlets, legacy papers, whatever you want to call them, like the New York Times, like the Guardian. There's the Committee to Protect Journalists as well, which is a media freedom watchdog, but an establishment one. If you see who's on the board and who funds it, you do now have key people coming out and saying this case is a threat to press freedom. I think that it helps the fact that it's the Trump administration doing it, although even then it took them a couple of years. So despite claiming to genuinely Washington Post ended up adding the tagline "Democracy dies in darkness" after Trump was elected, right? Apparently it wasn't an issue under Obama, where the Espionage Act was used more times to target sources of leaks under his administration than all other previous administrations combined. So that's saying something. Worse than Nixon, worse than all the others in terms of using it to target sources. I mean,
Right. Yeah,
so
going after whistleblowers in a full-scale war.
Exactly. I think there were 7 people in total who were targeted, who were state officials. And in fact, they wanted to go after Assange. And we know the Attorney General then, was it Eric Holder, had said, like, we tried to, and then we couldn't quite see how we could without also saying we'd have the right to go after New York Times and Washington Post, right? And I think for a long time they felt shielded and protected, right? Because being an establishment paper, you understand that there are lines that you won't cross, or if you do have a massive reveal, you don't do that every day, right? So the way WikiLeaks works, first of all, WikiLeaks is not a state allied or aligned organization. Whereas when you hear journalists, including editors from The Guardian, the New York Times, or Washington Post, they do or others, Le Monde in France, they refer to we when they're talking about, they are nationalists in the lower end case, right, sense, right? They identify with their state. They may think that they've done things wrong, that they cross lines, etc., but they identify, and as such, there will be, limits to how they report and how they criticize and how they frame things. WikiLeaks is not like that, right? It doesn't see itself like, at the end of the day, we're all on the same side, but we just need to shine a bit of light into the darkness every now and then for the good of the state, for the good of the nation, right? That's not how it works. It's not allied with any particular government. And I think that sort of irks those who feel that like they cross a line, they go too far. So until recently, we haven't really been seeing support from higher ups and these outlets, but you're right, that has changed as it's become more and more clear that what others were warning about, and Assange himself was warning about, that everything that's going on, including what was going on with Sweden, was ultimately about bringing him to the United States in order to criminally prosecute him for his role in publishing the Afghan diaries and the Iraq war logs, which is something that they didn't have a problem with overall, right? Remember, that was when Assange was still popular, including among liberals. That was when he was mainstream, as it were, because lots of these things were more linked to the Bush administration anyway. So if you're a liberal, you more identify, say, with the Obama administration. And even if some of these things were ongoing and the revelations happened under Obama, lots of it was more like, well, these are Bush's wars. Obama just inherited them, that kind of thing.
Yeah, there was an intentional fracturing of cognitive reality from George Bush's wars and Barack Obama's administration. Even though he not only did he continue those wars, he started 5 brand new ones. He engaged in several coups. He was one of the more militaristic presidents we had. He dropped more bombs and engaged in what Noam Chomsky calls the global assassination program, the drone program, more so than his predecessors. And yet still is somehow, kind of heralded as a good president instead of a keeper and caretaker of Reaganomics and the neoliberal war machine. It's to this day even, but you're absolutely right when you say that it being Trump's administration that has gone forward and picked up the ball from what Obama and Eric Holder deemed the New York Times problem. Donald Trump doesn't have a problem with going after any journalist or publisher. He is 100% a cartoon character of an authoritarian leader. The simple fact of Mike Pompeo calling WikiLeaks a hostile non-state agency, and that's setting the tone for how the Trump administration has gone after them, should be something that even mainstream outlets are reporting on every single day. Like, if this organization is a hostile non-state terrorist organization, and what they do is publish stuff that embarrasses governments, what does that make the Washington Post for their release of the Afghan papers, which did nothing but corroborate everything that WikiLeaks had said almost 10 years ago?
Well, you're exactly right. Washington Post just published a massive expose that reveals that every single government involved in the Afghan war, both from the military brass as well as officials from the actual civilian branch of government, if you like, from Bush, Obama, and Trump, have all lied about what's going on in Afghanistan, right? So, but it's okay when they do it because it's the Washington Post, right? So it's and the Washington Post, ironically, historically, is known for its links to the CIA, even before Jeff Bezos bought it out. And I assume, but just in case everybody who's watching the live feed doesn't know, in addition to Jeff Bezos, the head of Amazon, buying out the Washington Post, he also sits on a board with the U.S. Defense Department, and has a few $100 million deal with the CIA, providing them cloud storage services.
So Bezos actually just a month or two ago lost that contract. He lost it to Microsoft. Microsoft has the servers now. Microsoft also partnered with DARPA recently to guarantee our election security. So Bezos, it's interesting because Bezos lost the contract to store the CIA's cloud data, and within, I think, 72 hours before or after, released the Afghan papers. Like, the timing of it was almost a little knife stick. But Bezos also controls a giant grocery store, controls what else is he? He has IMDb, he has Twitch, he's got a number of different companies and methods of internet payment that that could be used to manipulate the narrative in any number of ways. He is without a doubt one of the shadiest characters that we have going on a global scale. And the fact that he looks like Lex Luthor really doesn't help anything. It really doesn't. Like, I say all the time that we live in a cartoon. We have literal cartoon villains running around making decisions that affect all of us, and they're insulated from of this by billions and billions of dollars and the ability to hire private security in order to take care of us. It's coming to a point in my mind, and we see this play out globally everywhere but the Five Eyes countries, where mass protests are taking place, and it's going to happen within the Five Eyes countries in order to resonate with anyone who lives inside of them. Because when there's 130,000 people in the streets in Chile, or every single day or every single weekend for 67 weeks now, 68 weeks, we have no coverage of it, but they're forced to cover it when we're standing outside of their our own halls of power.
And so, Mohammed, I want to ask you, because you are in the UK and you've gotten to experience some of Julian's case management hearings, what are you seeing as far as the operation of the UK justice system, and your reflections on if it is a disadvantage to Julian, how he's being treated in these hearings, and what are you expecting to happen in Belmarsh Court when the extradition hearing actually begins in a couple of weeks?
Okay, so I can say that he's not being treated as well as he should, or as, quite frankly, any human being should, by the system. The lawyers have been continuously complaining to the judge who's overseeing the extradition hearings that the laptop, which took forever for prison authorities to finally allow Assange to have access to, doesn't have all the necessary capabilities that it requires in order for him to review the case files. They also say that they're not getting enough FaceTime with him, which is, of course, outrageous given the fact that he faces extradition to the US and up to 175 years imprisonment if convicted. I have to say about the judge, she comes off as genuinely irritated. I mean, I used to be in law before I was in journalism. I've been in journalism for the last 3 years or so. And the focus of the lawyers that I worked with was in human rights. And we did, I never worked on extradition cases before, but we did on lots of immigration cases and cases in the High Court and appellate cases, the Court of Appeal. And sometimes you do get judges who are just, just come out of being, like they're doing you a favor just by sitting there, and every time a lawyer raises a point, it looks like they've got to take a breath so as not to bite the lawyer's head off. It's just sort of frustrating that this is the type of person that you've got to deal with. The other frustrating thing is her refusal to intervene with prison authorities. So being told constantly that this is the case, that Assange is not getting proper access with his lawyers. The first time round I was there, she said, I'm sorry, I have no jurisdiction over the conditions over which Assange is being held. So that was the end of that. The next hearing, the lawyers raised the issue, say, here, I have an example of a High Court judge also working on a separate case, completely separate case, where the person is also in Belmarsh prison, and also wasn't getting proper access to their lawyers. And the judge got on the phone, called up the prison governor, and explicitly told them to sort it out. And the prison governor of Belmarsh sorted it out. And so she was presented with this precedent, i.e., look, you can intervene. You can call up the prison and tell them to give proper access. They're not giving enough access to the prisoner. And she said, I'm willing to go as far as to make a statement in open court that it would be helpful if the prison ensured full access to the prisoner. Literally, so it's like, okay, so what signal does that send to the prison governor, right? Where one judge has called them up on the phone and said, get your shit together. And the other one just makes a generalized statement that it would be helpful. Like, literally, this is the kind of stuff that you're dealing with this judge when you're being told and these are very well-known lawyers. I mean, the Gareth Pierce, who was the solicitor, if you like. So here, the legal system is split up between barristers and solicitors. Barristers are the ones who wear the wigs. Solicitors don't. I won't go into further detail. People can look up online what the difference is between the two types of lawyers. Gareth Pierce, has worked on. She'll be known in the Supreme Court, right? She's known by practically every single person who's a lawyer, right? She's been around for a very long time, and she's worked on, Irish hunger strikers back in the day. She's represented all manner of figures over the years. But it doesn't seem to make much difference. So he's recently been relieved from solitary confinement, where he was being held in the medical wing of Belmarsh Prison. He's now in a wing with about 40 inmates, the area that he's been moved to. That followed intense pressure from lawyers and the public, but also specifically fellow inmates. I don't know if that news made it to the US. So fellow inmates in Belmarsh Prison drafted 3 separate petitions, and on 3 separate occasions put those petitions to the prison governor saying the way you're treating Assange is unfair. And if you know anything about Belmarsh, it is a high security prison, right? This is where people convicted of it.
Yeah, in the US, and I'm sure you've heard this analogy be made, but it is the UK's Guantanamo. So yeah, that news has made it to the US, and we were aware that it was actually an effort on behalf of other prisoners to get him out of solitary confinement, which is a good thing. This is a big victory for people who support him, a big victory for his legal team, and for him personally to be able to coexist among the other prison population. Now, we do also want to talk about a recent interview that was done with the UN Special Rapporteur on Torture, Nils Melzer. We frequently discuss him on this vigil and his findings. And he determined back in May of last year, in 2019, that Julian was unfortunately being subjected to torture. The UK government has still not responded to this letter that Nils Melzer had given them. So we are going to play this video for you and for the viewers, and then we'll discuss it. I'm sorry?
It's Mohammed's interview with Nils that we're playing right now.
Okay.
Yeah. But if you want to set this up real quick while we get it rolling, Mo, please do.
This is the one where I'm filming him, right?
Yeah,
not where he's at the podium speaking.
Right. No, this is the shorter clip, I believe.
Okay, so basically, I put to him, I said, okay, well, what do you say? Do you understand why some people are saying you're going beyond your mandate? Is this how you behave with other cases? Where you'll go on television and you'll write articles and so on and so forth, because he's been heavily criticized that he's going too much in public, right? That he's going beyond the mandate of the UN Special Rapporteur on Torture, this is the response he gives me as to why it is that he's gone a bit above and beyond what in some of his other cases, because he will take on average 2 new cases a day. He gets sent 15 requests a day. He can only, with the resources he's been given, take on 2 from around the world. So it's so I thought it was a good response he gave me. That's why I sent it through.
Yes. And this is not I was mistaken earlier. I thought we were showing you guys the video of him at the podium where he was addressing a crowd. This is your interview, Mohammed's interview with Nils Melzer.
It's playing, is it?
When did you decide that you were going to start speaking out in a way that is more irregular compared to how you normally do, how you normally work as a UN Special Rapporteur?
Look, I mean, I come from very conservative institutions like the International Committee of the Red Cross. I was a national security advisor for the Swiss government, Swiss Foreign Affairs. I've worked for conservative think tanks like the Geneva Center for Security Policy. And that's exactly how I conducted my mandate. So I stick to my procedures in good faith, and I submitted my observations and my recommendations to the governments involved in various cases, including now the Assange case. Obviously then, if states don't react in good faith, if they ignore my recommendations, they don't have to agree with me, but at least they have to respond. I mean, that's my function. They mandated me to investigate cases and submit my observations and make recommendations and ask questions in the expectation, obviously, that they then would respond and we can clarify these issues. But when I see that governments simply ignore my recommendations and refuse to engage in a dialogue, then I have to move to different fora, because then we have bad faith in play. And bad faith in the implementation of the prohibition of torture is not a good thing for anyone.
And do you normally get a proper response when dealing with other countries, say like Iran or Russia?
Russia, remarkably, has a tradition of sending very elaborate responses. Not in every single case, but I have to say they're certainly much more consistent than what I've received from the UK in the last year.
Okay, thank you.
So his point to you, Mo, and I do hope we're back on Zoom now. But his point to you about these countries don't have to agree with me, but they don't get to ignore me. It seems like that is finally starting to gain some traction simply because he went outside of speaking directly to these governments and started talking to people, regular people, about it. And only through him recognizing, I suppose, that his mandate exists not only to bring attention to the fact that people are being tortured, but bring that attention to more than simply government officials, is what's allowing for it to gain some traction. Am I off on that, or do you get that sense as well?
Absolutely. And if you hear his background, when he describes his background as being a conservative background, working for a conservative think tank in Switzerland, working as a national security advisor to the Foreign Office of the Swiss federal government, even the ICRC is not exactly, it is in many respects a small c conservative organization. It brings with it, I think, a certain credibility, if you like. So, and quite often I hadn't heard actually him describe parts of his background before, but really it's the number of petitions now I've seen, the number of documents, the number of comments from politicians as well, including, center-right politicians, including from Germany. The number of people and organizations, for example, the International Federation of Journalists, the Council of Europe, which I'll mention in a minute, they've all mentioned Nils Melzer's report. So I was told by somebody I greatly respect, a very well-experienced criminal defense lawyer based in the United States, that they thought that Melzer's behavior was maybe not necessarily helping Assange, that it shows him as being a bit too partisan. Although, as Melzer himself has said, is like, well, I am partisan. Once I've investigated and I found that torture has occurred, then I am partisan in favor of the torture victim, right? I am no longer neutral once that's happened. So I would say the momentum that's built that you've described has definitely, at least in part, been influenced by the reporting and the constant action, the activity by Nils Melzer, because that's what they themselves say. So just to finish up on that point, the Council of Europe, sometimes people confuse the European Union and the Council of Europe, two completely separate organizations, right? So after the end of the Second World War, a document known as the European Convention on Human Rights was drafted. And the Council of Europe was set up to sort of observe and try to enforce that to an extent, right? So the European Court on Human Rights is part of that. And Britain is a founding member, right? In fact, Britain was heavily involved in drafting the European Convention on Human Rights. It was the first country to ratify it. And it is a founding member of the Council of Europe, and it remains so. It is completely separate from the European Union, right? So the Council of Europe has a parliamentary assembly that meets a couple times a year, right? And they pass in resolutions. They're also responsible for voting for who becomes the judges, if I recall correctly, on the European Court of Human Rights. And the parliamentary assembly is literally made up of like 300 plus state legislators from all the member states. So there'll be members of parliament from the UK. There'll be people from the German parliament. I'm not going to try to pronounce it because my German is non-existent. And same thing in France and all the other countries that make up the 20 plus members of the Council of Europe, right? So these are people who are already elected as political representatives in all the various countries. And they unanimously passed a resolution on media freedom, being very concerned about attacks and assaults on media freedom within Europe, within Council of Europe states. And there's a section on it where they explicitly immediate release, the prompt release is their language, of Julian Assange. They say Julian Assange's extradition to the United States must be barred, that's their language, and that he must be released promptly. That's a really big deal. And they explicitly endorse the position of Nils Melzer, the UN Special Rapporteur on Torture. So yes, I would say that has been very influential when you think about the fact that these are people who, there would have been a time where Assange wouldn't have been touched with a barge pole by many people who are politicians, after all, because that's who the Parliamentary Assembly are made up of. Accusations surrounding the preliminary investigation into sexual assault claims in Sweden. And what we've seen is that there is a new groundswell of support that's building up, including in establishment institutions. And the Council of Europe, at the end of the day, is a governmental human rights body. It's an intergovernmental human rights body, right? It's not an independent group.
Now, once we get through this first round of extradition hearing and we have some kind of verdict, is the Council of Europe a body that Julian's legal team can appeal to on that decision? Are they able to, in any way, shape, or form, to step in if the UK decides that yes, he's going to be extradited to the UK? What power do they have to perhaps block this from happening, or do they?
So as Melzer pointed out when I spoke to him about this, the resolution they passed is non-binding. Right? They don't have the ability to demand. I mean, they can demand action, but it's not entrenched with legal force, as it were. It's very important politically. It's politically significant. However, after the judge makes her decision, District Judge Vanessa Beretzer is her name. After she makes her decision, and people keep calling what's coming up the trial, right? Which is split into two parts. 1 week from 24th of February. And then 3 more weeks from the 18th of May, right? So there's going to be a big chunk in the middle where there's not much going on other than prep, as it were. After her decision, and the reason I say it's important to understand that it's not a trial, even though that's what people are sort of referring to it for understandable reasons, is because there is no guilt that needs to be established here. In fact, even the requirement that there's a prima facie case established by the Americans, that requirement that used to exist in the extradition treaty is pretty much gone. So pretty much the way the extradition law with the US exists with a few exceptions, is that if the US asks for somebody, the presumption is they know what they're doing and the person should be deported, not deported, extradited to the United States, where they have a high-level justice system, one of the best in the world, right? That's the presumption. And there's a few exceptions. You can't be extradited if the crime is a political crime. You shouldn't be extradited if what they're alleging is a crime in the US is not a crime here. And that's a known, by the way, that's a known thing with other states as well, that if you're charging somebody with a crime of blasphemy, but we don't have blasphemy laws, then we shouldn't anymore, because we used to. And in fact, technically we still do, but they're not really used. Then you shouldn't be extradited to a country to face punishment for a crime that doesn't exist. Those are the types of arguments that will be addressed. And then there's health implications. After her decision, it can still be appealed potentially to, I don't know whether or not a high court judge will be able to review it, but then there'll be the Court of Appeal. If they accept, right, of course they've got to accept jurisdiction or interest, right? You have to apply for permission to appeal. If the judge doesn't grant permission to appeal, then you've got to pay more money and ask the Court of Appeal for permission to appeal to them. And then if they say yes, then they'll hear your arguments. After that, there's the Supreme Court. And then after that, potentially, yes, the European Court on Human Rights, potentially, if you've got the right kind of grounds. They've got to be human rights grounds, right? You'd have to say that the extradition will violate certain aspects of his human rights, either because of the disproportionality of what he faces in the US, or because what he faces is a political crime, or what have you. So, but this could go on potentially for a couple of years in terms of the appellate stage.
Now, Mohammed,
And where
what
does
does
that leave?
the UK court have to show? I believe that do they have to prove anything? I think that's a pretty high standard. What do the prosecutors have to show in this case?
They have to show very little. That's the problem, right? Because they don't actually have to. Yeah. So because this is an extradition case, like I said, it's not a trial.
Mm-hmm.
The treaty is set up so that the US makes a request, and then you have a branch of immigration police, extradition police linked to the Metropolitan Police Service, who should just execute the warrant, right? So then you'll have the foreign minister here who should sign off on it, or is it the Home Office minister? I can't remember. Either the interior minister or the minister for foreign affairs, one of the two, will sign off on it, and then that's it. So like I said, the presumption is in favor of extradition in terms of the US, and it's almost the burden of proof is almost on you to argue why you should not be extradited to the US. Because
that is fascinating to me, because typically, at least in our systems, like in the Western world, the system is meant to be designed or meant to be in favor of the defendant inherently, and the burden of proof is on the state. But it seems that in extradition, that is not at all the case.
Well,
true.
that's the marketing.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know what it would be like with Saudi Arabia, for example, or you know what I mean? So it depends what state you got it with. But you're right in that, and in fact, there used to be more exemptions. So it used to be possible for the Home Secretary to make a political decision not to sign off on it or to intervene. And in fact, Theresa May, who was Prime Minister, who's since been replaced by Boris Johnson, before she was Prime Minister, she was Home Secretary, which is internal security. And when she was Secretary for Home Affairs, she intervened on an extradition case to the US because of massive public pressure. And this was somebody who, a technologist who had Asperger's, who was accused by the Americans of, like, I think he was searching
Lori Love?
No, this is before Lori Love.
Okay.
And he was searching for, I think, proof of extraterrestrial life, thought that maybe the American government might have some hidden somewhere, and was accused of like hacking into things. And the Americans wanted to make a go of him, and actually it was a very big deal because he faced many, many years in prison, and with his mental conditions, believed that he could end up committing suicide or what have you. So in the end, enough political pressure rose up that the Home Secretary intervened and blocked his extradition. I think that power has since been removed, right? And there were other things like human rights grounds have to be considered, right? There was a phrase like that, which I think that has since been removed as well from the law, which is worrying. right? When a requirement to consider human rights is removed from, it's one of those situations that when you have high-profile successes on certain in laws, they're quite often removed. Like there's a public interest defense that used to exist, so that if you violated the Official Secrets Act of this country, that you could say what I revealed was in the public interest. And there was a case where a person did do this, the famous Spycatcher case, and it went to trial, and he had a jury, and he argued that what he revealed in his book, yes, he violated the Official Secrets Act, but it was in the public interest, and he was found not guilty, and then Parliament removed that defense. So now there is no defense to revealing documentation to violating the Official Secrets Act. So in that respect, it's sort of similar to the Espionage Act. But just to end on the extradition hearing, yeah, it's really for the defense to argue why he shouldn't be extradited. And that's why they're coming up, they'll say it's a political, you can't extradite someone for a political offense. He's at risk of torture or death in a supermax facility that will be disproportionate. They talk about his own health implications, and there'll be other aspects as well that I have yet to see because I haven't seen their skeleton arguments.
Are you familiar enough with UK extradition law to know if Julian stays on remand during the appeals process? Is there a way that he could be released, like even under supervision? Or will the 2 to 3 year appeals process mean that he is still arbitrarily incarcerated at Belmarsh?
So I'm not an expert in extradition law, although I can tell you that the reason he remains on remand, remains in custody at Belmarsh, despite the fact that he finished his 50-week sentence in September 2019 for absconding while on bail. That's when he sought asylum, by the way.
Yeah,
So
they
he
didn't
shouldn't-
issue the warrant until a week after he had been granted asylum and was
Yeah.
in the embassy. The whole warrant on its
Yeah.
face is.
But even so, asylum is a right. Asylum is a right under international law. It's not like he just ran off as chief of state. He sought asylum and he received it. So by prosecuting him and convicting him in a 15-minute trial, by the way, for jumping bail while he was on while he had sought and obtained asylum, which is a right under international law, itself makes a mockery of the right to asylum, right?
Yeah.
But the reason he's being kept by the judges, right? He's being kept because he's convicted of absconding while on bail. That's it. Has nothing to do with the extradition treaty with the U.S. Laurie Love, when he was fighting his extradition, he wasn't. He was detained very briefly, and his parents were able to raise the few £1,000s for bail. He was released on bail. So if this judge or a future judge or however things develop, somebody wants to, they can say, yeah, okay, fine, you can be released now with a monitor, ankle monitor, or whatever it is. They just don't want to do it. So, and it's quite difficult to convince a judge to release someone on bail if they've already been convicted for absconding on bail, unfortunately. Why he has to be detained in a maximum security prison where people serious offenses are kept, that's another issue. Why he can't be in a more minimum security open air prison where he can visit his lawyers and family more. That's something people are calling for, by the way. That's not like a crazy idea. But of course, the judge would say, well, this is beyond my jurisdiction. This has nothing to do with me. This is up to prison authorities, et cetera, et cetera.
So is it a burden of proof on the legal team to demonstrate that he's being held on remand as purely a political prisoner, rather than someone who may be a flight risk?
I mean, who are you going to be able to make that argument to, right? He was convicted he was convicted in an English court. Right? They didn't proceed to appeal. They could have appealed it, but they made their decisions not to appeal it. So he's convicted for skipping bail. I should point out that he got the maximum. Meanwhile, somebody else, known as the speedboat killer, who had literally killed another human being, right? Not deliberately, but he'd killed another human being, was on bail, and then jumped bail. And he didn't go and plead asylum somewhere. He wasn't granted asylum. He skipped out while on bail. He didn't get the max. He didn't get 50 weeks, right? Nobody gets that time period. There's all kinds of other issues with that as well. When he was in the Swedish embassy, his lawyers contacted the British government and said, hey, look, he's prepared to surrender, pay a fine, and do time if that's what's necessary on the bail issue. All we need from you is a guarantee he will not be deported, extradited to the United States. And if you recall at the time, the US, everyone was saying Assange was crazy, that he was just avoiding, he didn't want to face up to an investigation in Sweden. But what wasn't being publicized was that, and we know this from discussions with the former Ecuadorian foreign minister, is that they repeatedly contacted the British government, which repeatedly refused to sign an agreement that he wouldn't be extradited to the US, even though there were no public charges against Assange. And same thing with the Swedish government. They said, okay, look, the Ecuadorian government said to the Swedish government, okay, look, Assange and his lawyers say he's willing to come to Sweden, right? You just have to sign an agreement that you're not then going to just use that as an excuse to deport him, extradite him to the US, and they refused. So that's part of the story that people don't know, is that there were constant negotiations. The Swedes and the Brits just weren't interested in it. And we see now with what's going on today, that with the Swedish case having dissolved into air, right? All that's left are, 18 charges, 17 of which are under the Espionage Act, and all of the charges of which relate to the Iraq and Afghan war logs and diaries. So yeah, there's nothing that is up to a judge to decide. Maybe you could make the argument his mental health is suffering so badly he should be released. It might be an appealing up to the Court of Appeal. Lots of this stuff might end up having to come from higher up judges. Not that they're more enlightened or progressive. They're not. In fact, we're in a conservative era with our Court of Appeal. But if enough, I don't know what it's like in the US. I've been told by, once again, a very experienced criminal defense lawyers and human rights lawyers in the US, that generally public pressure doesn't help as much in terms of the trial aspects, possibly in terms of sentencing or what have you.
I actually do. I am receiving my master's in journalism, and part of my study was I did a study on media coverage of court cases, criminal court cases, and not specifically if public pressure impacts the case, but it was basically just about if media coverage would in any way sort of sway a public's perception of that defendant and therefore impact the case. And it absolutely does. And that applies in this case as well. So it's sort of related to what you were saying. But the point is that when there's negative media coverage about a person, and then they're tried in that district and they've been exposed to this information, it will impact their case ultimately, which I find to be very problematic. And we're seeing that happen with Julian's case as well. But go on with your point, because I think that's very important, what you're saying here.
No, absolutely, right. So he can have the disadvantage of the negative publicity, but not the advantage of the positive publicity. But you're right so just on that point, that we can get more positive outcomes from appellate judges in his case. So even if this district judge, the magistrate judge, rules against Assange, if enough groundswell has built up, right, it can assist, because of course, these judges, they read establishment papers, right? They read the Guardian and the Financial Times and the Daily Mail and all the rest of them. And as this case goes on for longer, the groundswell of support across all kinds of different groups of people is building up in favor of Assange. So as that happens, that helps to influence the minds of the judges. I know this seems very outside of the law and in the realm of politics, but that's the reality. So it's the reality is, of course, judges are influenced by political reality. You can see it in their decisions when they rule positively or negatively. They are ultimately, at the end of the day, guardians of the system. And so if they can be convinced that the system is brought into disrepute by supporting a particular position, as long as you also have good lawyers making good legal arguments that can help to push them in a particular direction. I mean, one of the last cases I worked on before transitioning, as it were, into journalism was involving people known as the Cuban Five or the Miami Five, who were Cuban intelligence officers who infiltrated far-right groups in Miami, which were linked to committing terrorist acts against people in Cuba, blowing up bars and cafes. I don't know how much you know about that, but over a number of decades, over 3,500 Cubans have been killed as a result of CIA-backed sort of terror by linked to Miami, basically, over decades, including the blowing up of a plane with students from Korea and Cuba, fencing students, and that was in the 70s. The worst airplane terrorist act until 9/11 in that hemisphere. And they revealed to the FBI what they had discovered, the evidence they had discovered, which didn't involve waterboarding anyone or torture or what have you. But in the end, they were the only ones who were given heavy sentences, so not the people that they'd infiltrated, and they were given close to life sentences. So they've all since been released because of massive public pressure from around the world over decades, right, over like 20 years. And I worked on a case to help bring them to this country so they could meet people who lobbied on their behalf, and you know, there were unions over here that worked for many years and supported their case. Now, we have a law here that prevents people from coming into the UK if they've been sentenced to a crime for 10 or more years. And these guys got 20, 30, 40 years, right? And we got 3 very conservative members of the Court of Appeal who ended up hearing our case. And in the end, we won, right? And so there is avenue, even if you have conservative judges, even if the way the law is drafted is on the face of it is against you. I mean, what do they have to gain for allowing some Cubans who are convicted of espionage and given decades sentences in the US over here to Britain? And this was when Obama was president. Like, what do they have to gain for that? But there was a decent amount of, it was clever lawyering combined with a decent amount of public support. And in the end, it was positioned of like, well, what's there to lose? There's no argument that they're going to be a danger here, that they're going to commit crimes, or that they're going to stay here. They don't want to stay here. They want to go back to Cuba after like a week visit. And that's what ended up happening. So you can build up enough support and enough momentum. As we said, there are establishment editors and newspapers are now coming out against the extradition. New York Times, right? The Guardian. And that's very important. And that is, so even if we lose with this judge, the district judge, the magistrate judge, we can win with the on appeal. It's sad that we have to be thinking about the appeal already before the main hearings, but that's just the reality of the situation.
And so I just want to take a moment. We've been talking extensively about the extradition hearing and then what comes afterwards. I do want to take a moment just to remind our audience that we are still fundraising for the Free Assange Vigil to attend in London during that hearing that begins on February 24th. Steve and Taylor are planning to be in London on the ground and outside Belmarsh to be reporting and streaming on our channel. Myself and Andrew will be in DC, and we are planning peaceful protest actions. I want everyone to know that they can go to our website, actionforassange.com, and you can click to donate. We are in the home stretch. We've almost reached our goal. And so we have these last 2 weeks. We really want people to share the link on social media and to donate if you haven't already. Also, we do have a button on our website. If you are going to be in DC or close by and you want to take part in the events, click the DC event sign up. That way we got your email address and we can keep in touch with you on details and let you know the day-to-day actions that we're taking so that as many people as possible can come to DC and show support. And yeah, I've put those links in the chat too for everybody, but please do share on social media and help us in this last home stretch. And I do want to give a shout out to William Martyr. I think he's in our chat now, or he usually is. He did just donate recently. And just a big thank you to everybody who has been donating and supporting and sharing this online for us.
Yeah, thank you to everyone. We cannot make this happen without you. And we really mean that. We are so grateful for your support of what we do and for us to cover this very important extradition hearing, because it is the biggest press freedom case of recent history. Also with that,
total history, world history. This is, you know, honestly, like,
I know, but
when you look
there
at
were other cases like a long time ago that really shaped how we interpret the First Amendment that were like very fundamental. So that's why I'm saying recent history, just to be clear on that, because things like prior restraint, I mean, that was a huge case, and that would be very detrimental. So I'm just being cautious when I say recent history. But also, too, I want to make a quick note real quick. There is going to be some demonstrations in London as well. I saw it on Instagram. WikiLeaks tweeted it out. So if you are interested in showing your support for Julian Assange and for press freedoms and freedom of speech, go there. Steve or I will be there. I think one of us should probably be covering that as well for you guys. So we'll have that all planned out. But yeah, there's something going on throughout the world, I believe, during this week, or not this week, but the week of the extradition.
Yeah, there's been an international global day of action that's been announced on February 24th. I would encourage the people who are going to take part in that to continue that throughout the week, if at all possible. I'm going to take go back to the court system thing here real quick, because right now in the United States, we have by far the most actively conservative Supreme Court that we have had in a very, very, very long time. And it brings up a weird kind of juxtaposition of ideals in terms of how the Supreme Court will legislate and what they will determine if this case gets brought before them. Because on the marketing side, they are strict constitutionalists that believe the Constitution is a set in stone document, not that it is a living, breathing one, and it should be interpreted, that's a word, I swear, within the most strict confines. Now, what that says is that the First Amendment is a sacrosanct thing, and there is absolutely nothing in the Constitution that says a non-state publisher isn't allowed First Amendment protections if their material is published in the United States. A strict constitutionalist would look at this case and say, well, the Constitution doesn't corroborate what the defense or what the prosecution is saying, therefore we have to rule against it. However, the activist bent that these Supreme Court justices have and what they have said in previous cases tends to align with a more reactionary type of conservatism. So it interests me and horrifies me that this case may come before a United States Supreme Court, which is why our efforts are being put into keeping Julian Assange from being extradited to the United States. That process is going to play out, I hope, heavily from the time that the hearing ends on the 28th until the next hearing begins in May. And it is my hope that we can, through Action for Assange, promulgate a number of actions in between then and now and do everything that we possibly can in the name of no extradition before we have to worry about what Justice Clarence Thomas thinks, or any of the Scalia acolytes that now sit on the U.S. Supreme Court.
Absolutely. You're right to make a distinction between small c conservative and big C reactionary. But at the same time, Roberts showed that he could be a pragmatist when he approved certain parts of Obamacare. Not that I'm the biggest fan, but he was a Republican appointee, as it were, right? Or more right wing. But the thing is, when you sit at the top of the guardians of the establishment, you do end up finding yourself having to make sort of pragmatic decisions to sort of maintain. I mean, it was conservatives or right wingers on the Supreme Court that swayed the vote in favor of gay marriage. True, right? So even though these people represent a branch of the United States political class, which is linked to, I'll say, like anti-gay positions, it's become so mainstream among U.S. public, and it doesn't cost capitalists anything, right? To say that gay people can marry, right? So if it's mainstream among the public, they think, okay, well, why not? So you do have like political, of course, many of their other decisions are quite anti-environment and anti-labor, because that's what really matters at the end of the day in such a system. But yeah, it was a very progressive court that ruled under Oliver Wendell Holmes in 1919 that said, was it SNEC v. USA, that freedom of speech does not permit one, this is a paraphrasing, to yell fire in a crowded theater, right? And what was that case? That was a case about the Espionage Act, where somebody was leafleting people who were being recruited into the First World War, and he was criminally prosecuted, saying, don't go off, this is a banker's war, working class people should be able to decide whether or not they're going to go to war to kill and to die, and you should resist. And he was prosecuted and convicted under the Espionage Act. And it went all the way up to the Supreme Court, and Oliver Wendell Holmes, read out the decision for the majority, and time again. So you can have very progressive, enlightened people who, still rally around the system. And you might have more conservative judges or even reactionary judges who may decide that one particular decision is a step too far, or it might delegitimize the system. The legitimacy of the system is something that they will consider when making their decisions. If there's a line that can be cut, you know what I mean? If it's not obvious that they have to rule a particular way.
Yeah, in my personal opinion, it's maintaining the illusion of the legitimacy of the system, and that the system itself is designed to operate solely at the behest of the ruling class, and that when someone sticks their head up and shines a light onto the ruling class, that's when a situation like we're discussing right now takes place, where you have a multi-award winning publisher and journalist from an outlet with 100% accuracy rating facing 175 years in prison merely for printing things that embarrasses the government. And we do have a precedent here in the US from last summer when the DNC sued WikiLeaks and Julian Assange, and it came before Judge Kettle in District 9. I think it was District 9. Who was a Clinton appointed judge, so there wasn't a reason for him to go against the DNC in terms of pure spite. He had weighed the merits of the case, and he determined that Julian Assange was a publisher, that WikiLeaks deserves the same protections that the Washington Post received under the release of God damn it. But deserves the same protections that Daniel Ellsberg received, and reserves the same protections as the Pentagon Papers. That's what I was reaching for. So that precedent exists, but whether or not that transfers over into espionage court, I don't have a lot of faith of, because the Eastern District of Virginia Court, where Julian Assange would wind up, is the exact same courtroom that John Kiriakou went through. And he's described in detail on this vigil, on Unity for Jay, on my show, on Jimmy Dore's show, exactly how that process plays out, where it's a closed door hearing. The public only gets to find out what the judge leaks to the press. And even the evidence that the state is using against Julian, his lawyers will not have access to.
And there's no public interest defense under the Espionage Act. And where's the jury pool coming from? In Virginia, and where that area part of Virginia is, it's
intelligence or
exactly
ties.
Exactly. The majority of people who live there will be linked to the Department of Defense and to the CIA. I mean, the CIA is headquartered in Langley, in Virginia, and that area, it's like it's set up. As one person here said in a recent speech, the court there and the jury there will be bent before it's even begun. Bent as in corrupt, right? But not corrupt in that you have to be bribed or what have you, but bent in that it's a loaded jury system just because of the jury pool, right? So it will be a national security state jury pool.
Yeah, it would not be an impartial jury by any means. I mean, these individuals who would make up this jury in any other court would probably not even be accepted as jurors because of the clear conflict of interest there. But I believe that there is a very, very high conviction rate in this court for espionage cases. I want to say it's 100%. I believe it's 100%. If not, it's like very, very high.
No, I think 100% is the accurate number. At least that's what
Okay, I just want to make sure.
John's lawyer, Jesselyn Raddick, is one of his main lawyers, has made this point over and over and over. And she's the one who told John Kiriakou, this isn't about right and wrong, John. This is about mitigating, and like, this is about mitigating damage. That was the exact phrase. That's what your plea bargain is. That's what this court is about. That's what this case is hinged on, is mitigating damage. Now, there is very scant reason to believe that Julian Assange would be told anything different by any other member of his legal team when the conviction rate is there. It's the same judge, for F's sake. It's the same judge. It's, as you were saying, Mo, as Taylor was saying, it's ostensibly the same jury pool. You know, like almost the same jurors, realistically, in terms of thought process, location, conflict of interest. I've been to Northern Virginia. You can't throw a rock without hitting a spook or someone directly related to a spook. It is mind-boggling to think that there would be anything such as a sympathetic jury. And if any of the QAnoner people are here right now, it's also mind-boggling to think that this would be a public spectacle where Julian gets to walk in on all of the crimes that governments have committed in our names. Again, it's a closed door process. There are no witnesses to bear testimony after the fact to what was said in that case, unless the judge leaks something. And that will normally be her personal take on what has transpired.
Right, and because of these special administrative measures, we do have confirmation that that is going to happen. I think a lot of people wanted to believe that Julian will receive a fair trial here and that it will be open to the public and that justice will be served. But we are already seeing by what is being filed by the US prosecutors in the UK that that is not going to be the case.
Yeah, and quite frankly, even if you look at what's been done already, I mean, if you think about the fact that, you know, the UN Working Group on Arbitrary Detention has ruled that Assange, when he was in the embassy, because of the nature of what was going on, of why he was in the embassy, meant that he was being arbitrarily detained by the UK, the US, and the Swedish governments. And we're looking at this nearly 7 years. 7 years that he's been stuck there, plus now over a year in Belmarsh prison. So it's an example of how, not to sound all doom and gloom, but, you know, even without a conviction, right, they can rob you of you know, up to a decade of your life. And that's why the precedent, this needs to be shut down one way or another so that we don't have a continuing growing global precedent that, you know, things haven't been that great for journalists worldwide over the last few years. You know, an escalating level of violence. And I hate to say it, but countries like Britain and the US, they, you know, their behavior has ripple effects because they're so influential, right? How they behave sends signals to other states as to whether, like, oh, well, they don't need to listen to the UN Working Group on Arbitrary Detention, so neither do we. You know, in that video where I interviewed Nils Melzer, which I think you guys showed at the end, I asked him, I said, okay, well, what's the difference between the responses that you're getting from Britain and the US and Sweden versus, I don't know, other countries like Iran or Russia? And he said, well, actually, Russia has been very good and remarkably detailed in response to the cases that involve Russia that I've been working on compared to the UK, at least over the last year. So it's, I know people sometimes don't think these things matter, but they do matter. And we see what's going on with Glenn Greenwald in Brazil, right? With he's being chased by the Brazilian state along very similar lines that you've sort of violated rules.
Fortunately, a judge decided, fortunately, a judge has decided not to go through with the charge. But I believe that he was already a target of the state well before these charges
They
were.
dropped charges against him last September or last October.
And the judiciary had already said that he shouldn't be chased. So that's the thing. The Supreme Court had already made a ruling in Brazil. The Supreme Court had already made a ruling, and the chief prosecutor had already made a ruling that they can't go after him. And nonetheless, the government announced that he's being investigated, as it were. There's a sort of a pre-charge phase for criminal conspiracy for revealing those documents, which expose the fact that a very celebrated Brazilian judge who was involved in corruption investigations was himself actually bent, conspiring with prosecutors to sabotage certain people who would be political opponents of the now president of Brazil.
Yeah, it's cyber crime. And that's what relates it directly to Julian's case, is that instead of the focus being on press freedom or right to know or information, it's a cyber terrorism charge. And the branding of Julian Assange and Glenn Greenwald as cyber terrorists who committed cyber crimes, the focus of that, in terms of how the Crown Prosecutorial Service is going to lay it out, in terms of how the Bolsonaro government's going to lay it out, and in terms of how it's going to be laid out in the U.S. through the media and the court system, specifically to distract and specifically to take focus off of the global precedent this will set, the implications it has to journalists everywhere, the implications it has to publishers everywhere. In that PACE, the Parliamentary Assembly of the Council of Europe resolution, they go through and tell you exactly how many journalists have been murdered in the last decade. They go through and tell you how many have been incarcerated in the last decade. It's a frightening number, and there's, out of all of it, they use the word specifically, they were murdered with impunity in that resolution. The fact that governments can get away with murdering truth tellers with impunity should be a galvanizing force, not only in people who like us who are involved in journalism, but people who actually like to read, period. Like, who want access to credible, accurate information. It should be a concern. Whether public pressure has an effect on the legislative process is almost ancillary, given the fact there's going to be a number of months to galvanize public pressure on elected officials and people in the media currently, to get them to cover this in a way that drives home the point that the cybercrime thing is a narrative. They're being investigated for doing journalism. That's all it essentially amounts to. Going through and doing the practices that journalists have gone and done for decades now. Even in the advent of the internet, protecting your sources, a primary motive for a journalist to continue on with their profession. So we need to separate, I guess, the wheat from the chaff on that, and look at the cybercrimes narrative as this is 100% bullshit.
Yeah, it's conspiracy to commit computer intrusion is the one charge that's not linked to the Espionage Act, and that's relates to an alleged conversation between Assange and then Bradley, now Chelsea Manning, about how to access certain material or to be able to access material without it getting back to Bradley Manning, but it didn't end up anywhere, right? So it was an alleged discussion that led to nowhere. And that was the first charge that the Americans brought up in the indictment, right? And then eventually, I think because of the nature of how the extradition hearing was going, then it was like, okay, this is what it's really about. And then you have 17 more charges outlined, and they're all under the Espionage Act, right? But yes, yeah, you're absolutely right.
Yeah, and the panel at the Courage Foundation's event in DC, that were attorneys, they were saying that this conspiracy to commit computer intrusion charge was really dangerous, because that charge actually could encompass a lot of what journalists do all the time, like every day, and that's why it's so dangerous. And they said that it was even very concerning to them that Julian's case be the case to set the precedent with how that should be determined legally. We're trying to play catch up, I guess, with the permissible under the law and what is not. And also, his attorney did make the point, as Steve was saying earlier, Barry Polak, his U.S. attorney, said that this case is much more than just journalists. Under the First Amendment, well, I'm not going to try to paraphrase what he said, but in an interview together, he made the point to say that this does impact more than just journalists. It impacts everybody because it's saying that we don't have a right to know as citizens the crimes being committed by our government.
Yes, as someone else has pointed out, the First Amendment is meant to apply to everybody, right? And not just people who are officially accredited as journalists. And it's important to know that we know from the extradition proceedings that the US government is arguing that the First Amendment does not apply to non-US journalists. That is an argument that is now being brought up. At the same time, it was revealed that they would apply special administrative measures to Assange were he extradited to the US. So on the one hand, the US government is saying we can find a journalist anywhere in the world and demand that they be brought to the US to be prosecuted for espionage, for publishing US documents, even though they're not American and they owe no obligation to the US state, while at the same time denying those very people the constitutional protection guaranteed under the First Amendment. Whereas if you were an American and you'd done that, at least you'd have some kind of protection, assuming you're not an employee of the US government. So it is they're trying to have their cake and eat it. That's a perfect example of trying to have a cake and eat it. I should point out that in this country, they're discussing introducing, updating treason laws. So that's great. That's something a term that isn't really used here. I know it's been used a lot since Trump has been elected and you've got it in the Constitution, but you almost never hear anyone talk about treason here in the United Kingdom. Well, no more. That is being brought up again, and updating the Official Secrets Act. And this is quite worrying because there's a body called the Law Commission, and the Law Commission is a group of lawyers who advise on reforming the legal system, and I've never seen a Law Commission report that I've read something where I've disagreed. I might have thought it doesn't go far enough, but I've read it, and it's sort of liberal reforms. Like here, there's only one conviction, one sentence for murder, and that's a life sentence, right, in this country. So the Law Commission on multiple occasions says that it's too inflexible, right, just to say that it's automatic life sentence, right? They've suggested things like degrees, I think, like you have in the United States as well, in terms of murder, where there's no first degree murder or second degree murder or what have you here. But when they were asked to look at reforming the Official Secrets Act, they came out in 2017 with proposals that basically said it's not strict enough. We don't need a public interest defense, they said, even though people, during their review, journalists and organizations, the National Union of Journalists said, hey, we need a public interest defense again. So they got rid of that. They said, no, we don't need that. They also said the sentences should be longer for people who leak, right? So to like 15 years in prison, I think now. And they also said that journalists who publish should also be able to be, and not just the first journalist, a second and third journalist as well. So if I leak documents to you and you publish them, not only should you be able to be prosecuted, but if Steve then publishes what is already in the public domain, because to say Taylor's published it, then Steve too should be criminally prosecuted and be able to be convicted in terms of the law. So that because of everything that's going on, Brexit, the elections, all the rest of it, that got mothballed. But since Brexit is now over and Boris Johnson is now Prime Minister, it has been announced in what's called the Queen's Speech in December that is coming back on the table, that they're looking at updating their treason laws, their espionage laws, and their Official Secrets Act, and they're saying we're looking at to Australia and the US as a model. Literally, that's what it says. So that is also the context. It's important to understand the significance of this case.
Yeah, the Five Eyes countries. I mean, it's a great example of you see legislation that looks very, very similar being passed in countries who don't necessarily share borders with each other. So very interesting stuff. Mohammed, I want to thank you so much for joining us today and taking time to speak about Julian Assange. Before you do head out, if you could just give us some final words here, and then also do let everybody know where they can find you on social media and where they can find your work. And thank you again for coming on.
Okay, thank you again for the opportunity. Keep up the good work. I'll certainly share links to to future discussions. Yeah, so it's important that people sort of try to keep their head about them, right? That they don't lose it. Sometimes I see people losing it, and sometimes I see people lashing out at the legal team. And it's not really helpful when people start accusing the legal team of conspiring with the state without any actual evidence, hard proof of that. I've seen no evidence of that. I think people just don't realize this is their first experience foray into what's going on, and they think that everything must be a conspiracy. So that would be one of my final thoughts, and that what we've seen so far is promising, right? The prisoners coming out in favor and helping to bring Assange out of out of solitary. That's promising. The fact that the Council of Europe has come out in favor, the Parliamentary Assembly in favor of releasing Assange, that's promising. So the fact that we're seeing more and more establishment voices, 100 prominent Germans recently came out in favor of Julian Assange. There's a petition from lawyers as well that's going around. It will be published soon. I'm in discussions with some of the people who were involved in that. So yeah,
please come back on and talk to us about that, and we can, can share your work as well.
So you can find my work at the Canary, at Sputnik International. If you go to my profile, you'll see the people that contribute to, including like the Gray Zone. My own website blog, which I haven't had the time to update it in a while, is the interregnum.net. And it's just M from Mother or Muhammad. El Mazi is my Twitter handle on Twitter. So yeah, that's it.
All right. Thank you so much for coming on. And then Andrew, I know, has something he wants to touch us on.
So as you're heading out here, we're actually going to be talking about your facial recognition article. So I just want to say thank you for writing about that, because I haven't heard it from any other source at this point. In the U.S., before we get into this, as we get everything pulled up behind the scenes, there's actually a blooming movement here to ban facial recognition. Do you know of anything about that exists within the UK, and any sort of like infrastructure that's in place to get people in the streets to specifically target this? Because with it rolling out here just before the start of Julian's extradition trial, it feels very orchestrated to me, so they can identify the people in the streets who are standing up for this.
So am I aware of an actual movement? No, but I am aware there are organizations. So Big Brother Watch and Privacy International are two organizations which are explicitly opposed to the massive rollout of facial recognition by police. So there are two organizations that you can go and you can see their work and read their work. What I think is as things develop, you'll see movements grow, because their research has shown that there is overall support for the use of facial recognition by police, not with Black populations, not with Asian populations, perhaps surprising, perhaps not, and far less so among younger populations from teenage age up to the early 30s. So among older population and among more white population, more likely to find support in this country for the police use of facial recognition, less so as you move onwards. So no, that's a story that I'll be following on, but and I'd say those two are good places to start, those Big Brother Watch and Privacy International.
Well, thank you very much for joining us today, Mohammed. I really appreciate you coming on.
My pleasure. Thank you.
So if we could, would we be able to get that article pulled up so we can start going through it here?
I'll just exit. Fine.
Yeah, that's fine. Thank you very much, man. I really appreciate it again.
All right. Cheers. Yes. I hope that was useful.
Absolutely.
100%.
Yes, thank you for being on.
And I would, at some point, if we could, have you back on to talk a little bit about the history of the Espionage Act at some point, because that's a very nuanced, intricate, almost over 100 years at this point of political theory and process built around it. So if we could have you on to talk about that, that would be incredible.
Well, though it sounds like Taylor, who's doing her master's in law, right, might be covering it. Is that right? Your master's in law?
No, it's not in law. It's in journalism.
Oh, it's in journalism.
Yeah, no, not law, in journalism. And I was just studying and looking into basically how I'm interested in law, though. It's something that's always intrigued me, and that's perhaps why I'm very interested in Julian's case and care about it very deeply and the repercussions that we could face because of it. So I always felt that journalism is something that if you have an interest in other areas, it could always apply in some way. And I found a way to kind of connect those two. So yeah, we would love to have you back. I would love to speak with you more about the UK and typical extradition procedure. I know it's something that's quite rare that happens, but it's almost always political and controversial. So again, thank you so much for joining us.
My pleasure. Have a good one.
All right,
Good luck,
so
guys.
on the screen right now, we have an article. I know Andrew is really wanting to talk about this, this facial recognition. So we're going to be pulling that up for you guys on the screen. I want to thank our tech, A4A Tech, Josh Benton, for getting that up for us. And then Andrew, I will let you kind of summarize what this article is all about. You're muted.
Wonderful. So essentially what's going on in the UK right now is the rollout of a live facial recognition software. The article states in the secondary headline, anti-surveillance group Big Brother Watch describes the rollout of the live facial recognition technology by police as an erroneous expansion of the surveillance state and a serious threat to civil liberties. Authorities say that it will assist with the tackling of serious crimes, including gun and knife crimes and child sexual exploitation. If you could, Steve, could you talk a little bit about how facial recognition technology has been used here in the U.S. And kind of the intricacies and errors that we have just with our own use of facial recognition?
Yeah, facial recognition technology fails 97% of the time when identifying a person of color. This is something that both Fight for the Future and the Electronic Frontier Foundation, have reported on extensively. And no matter what you think about the direction or the people that are with those organizations now, their reporting is 100% solid on this. We have a number of cities and a growing amount of cities who are actively working to ban facial recognition. Oakland, California was one of the first. There are 2 cities in Massachusetts that have banned facial recognition successfully, and San Francisco is trying to, or has banned facial recognition that doesn't extend to airports, though, is my understanding. Facial recognition in use in terms of law enforcement is only about a decade old, and they have really, up until the last couple of years, only used it exclusively for under the umbrella of terrorism. What we saw an expansion of was in regular day-to-day law enforcement, and that's when Cambridge and God, I can't remember the name. Somerville, I think, Massachusetts is the name of the other Boston suburb that banned facial recognition. Really started to get into the fight when facial recognition got taken into, I guess, more all-encompassing policing, is, I suppose, the better way to put it. But it is just actively inaccurate. And there doesn't seem to be an effort within the digital and like law enforcement sectors to bring about more accuracy to facial recognition. It is an easy way to get someone into the system and to keep monitoring them regardless of their guilt. Is a gross violation of our civil liberties. It is it's hammering away at every shred of legitimacy to our Constitution. Yeah, I can't. I'm trying to reserve my temper on this and just not go off like I would normally go off on my own show about just how draconian and barbaric and backwards I believe the practice practice to be. Ahmed was talking before we were on the stream about how the MPS, the Metropolitan Police Service, is the organization that's rolling this out in the UK. And it kind of, as the MPS goes, so goes the rest of the law enforcement community, not just in the UK, but throughout Europe. So it's certainly reason to sit up and take notice whenever the MPS goes live with something like this, like they just did recently. I don't know if you want to go back to the article, but I hope I set the scene well enough for that.
Yeah, no, if we absolutely could. I want to pick up in the third part here, down where it says civil liberty groups call live facial recognition an erroneous expansion of the surveillance state. The Met's 24 January announcement was met with harsh criticisms from civil liberty groups. Privacy International went as far as to characterize the police's role of live facial recognition as a radical threat to the freedoms, which threatens to undermine democracy under the cloaking of defending it. London's at Met Police UK to begin live facial recognition. This radical threat to our freedoms, which threatens to undermine democracy under the cloak of defending it. Privacy International. Big Brother Watch, meanwhile, argued that the decision to use live facial recognition by the MPS represents an erroneous expansion of the surveillance state and a serious threat to our civil liberties. Silky Carlo, Big Brother Watch's director, said that they will challenge the decision as part of an ongoing legal claim against the police and the Home Office. It flies in the face of the independent review showing the Met's use of facial recognition is likely unlawful and risks harming public rights, and is 81% inaccurate, Carlo added. And so tools like this aren't used to help society. Tools like mass surveillance aren't used to help society in general ever. There's never been, to my knowledge, a threat that was stopped through the use of mass public surveillance. And a lot of times what happens, it's the direct opposite, where these people see someone that may be predisposed to doing something or of a particular ideology, and then find ways to manipulate that person emotionally and intellectually into committing acts of violence so you can label them as a terrorism. Which is a lot of what was seen throughout the Occupy movement, especially here in Cleveland, where there was FBI agents that infiltrated groups and convinced these people to try to blow up bridges. So mass surveillance isn't used for the public benefit. Mass surveillance is used to target political dissent. And that's the way that all police institutions, since state police institutions, since the very beginning, have been built to work, which is to defend the power of the state, not the rights of citizens.
So I'm going through and looking through some of the comments in the chat. No, you're spot on about that. Responding to a comment here about the argument is that there is no reasonable expectation of privacy in public. That seems to be the argument, and the counter to that is it's not just in public. They are inside your laptop, they're inside your phone, they're inside your television, your freaking microwave. Like this is
more than just a reasonable expectation of privacy issue. I know what that person's referring to, where there are certain places where that is a thing where it's like, okay, you're in public, so you do not have a reasonable expectation of privacy. This is beyond that in this case, or in this, when we're talking about the facial recognition.
Yeah, especially if it has an inaccuracy rate of over 90%. What it boils down to is more fear porn, more control, making people less willing to stick their neck out, making people less willing to speak up for an indefensible thing such as it's a terror tactic. Like that's about the nicest way that I can put it, is that the enforcement and the blanket implementation of facial recognition, whether it's in the UK or the United States or any of the Five Eyes countries or non-Five Eyes countries, flat out is a terrorist tactic. When I give those dramatic pauses, you guys are supposed to come in. I don't know if we've discussed that in pre-production, but now that we're like 7 months in, let's
Yeah, no, I hear you.
I figured I'd owed it to you to be quiet for a minute after mine.
Mhm.
No, but you're absolutely right. And what happens is these tools are going to be used to identify people as domestic terror attending protests. In the US, we already have, if you want to protest something, there's a free speech zone. Like there's a little box they build about 2 miles away from whatever you have a problem with, where you go and stand. And to the point that if you want to have a protest, you literally break the law. Like here in my state of Ohio, they were trying to pass measures, and it's successfully passed, but is being fought, I believe, to just label anyone protesting the expansion of oil and gas infrastructure as an eco-terrorist. Like, hey, if you don't want this built, you're obviously standing with the corporations, and we said this is good for it. And all technologies like this do is allow them to identify or misidentify people, because they can say, hey, we had this one hit here that kind of matches this one person here. Let's just say they're both terrorists. We have them on facial recognition. So it's a lot of nuance and intricacy that gets built into literally allowing these people to identify who it is they need to take out to stop a population from dissenting against their tyranny. And that's the whole design of the facial recognition system. And I guess really our only saving grace is the fact that it sucks. But at the same time, if they say, hey, we got a 60% match to Andrew Smith, go fucking arrest Andrew Smith. And then it turns into that person having to fight the technology in court, which will probably be put behind some kind of classified system.
Not only
Right.
that, but the
Good
burden of
point.
proof is shifted totally from being on the state to being on the defense. Like, I understand that the marketing says the burden of proof is on the state, but the reality is we have a thing called parallel collection, where law enforcement comes to a conclusion and uses illegal spying in order to substantiate that conclusion, and then the prosecution works backwards from that conclusion with that illegally obtained material in order to provide their case. There's a moment where I can't remember who it was for the goddamn life of me. It might have been Richard Eskow, RJ Eskow, where he had on film someone asking James Comey about parallel collection. And Comey does this like, well, I don't even know what you're talking about. Like, this is a totally foreign concept to me. Motherfucker, you're the head of the FBI. You know what parallel collection is because you order it. But they all pretend like it's some obscure, non-existent thing. And it really ultimately has put all of the burden of proof on the defendant. Like, we're in the upside down right now, currently. And more facial recognition, more erosion of civil liberties, more erosion of our basic human rights is the pathway that the people in power have chosen to keep us ultimately subjugated and in the dark and unable to properly defend ourselves. I guess is what I was trying to get at with that.
Yes, this is one of those pauses. I felt I needed to step in. This this is really an area where I feel that Steve and Andrew have a pretty good grip on. Christy, you may as well. But it is something that I think is scary, and it ties into the goals and the themes of what we want to highlight here on the vigils, which is talking about free speech, privacy, in a free press as well. So are there any other last thoughts on this? We also have 2 other clips of Nils Melzer that we are also able to show you to break this up a bit before our next guest joins us.
And looking very forward to another conversation from Sean O'Brien. If you've been tuning into the vigils for a while now, you've seen Sean with us a couple of times. He is a cybersecurity expert and lecturer at Yale University. He has an organization called Privacy Safe that builds like, I don't know, external safe zone, data protection devices for your computers. He is yeah, and he's always been a great guest, so we're looking forward to having him on. If you have, while we get the clip of Nils Melzer ready, if there are any questions in the chat, in either Gordon's chat or ours, please throw them at us. And if we have time before Sean comes on, we'll be happy to answer them. Big shout out to Flick Off for the super sticker. Thank you very much. We love your support. We do. And we're very grateful for it.
I do want to give a big shout out to Christian. I don't know if he's still in our chat. He gave us a huge donation earlier during our last guest, and that is putting us very, very close to our full goal. We are about a little around $400 away. So guys, we could hit this weekend, and anything we make over this is only going to help us with equipment, materials for the protest, things like printing banners, flyers, stickers. We've got a lot of stretch goal ideas too to help get the word out about Julian and his case, not only in London, but in DC. So please keep sharing the link. Thank you so much, Christian. Thank you to all of you who are donating and keep sharing that link.
And we are absolutely going to be going back to both London and DC when round 2 of the extradition hearings pick up. In the interim time, we would like to be doing more in-person organization, hopefully setting up essentially town halls or teach-ins with live audiences that we will stream to you. I have a meeting at 2 different, one's at an anarchist bookstore in Santa Cruz. The other one is at one of the oldest pubs in Santa Cruz called The Poet and the Patriot, which is, you know, your brick and mortar Irish pub. And it seems to me that a politics in the pub style event could be right at home and right in line with someone who has Patrick Pierce, you know, muraled on the wall outside of the building, and Michael Collins for that matter. I don't know how familiar with, you know, the Irish Revolution people are either in this particular Zoom call or in the lines, but I am. I've got a fairly good background and source material on that. But yeah, if you know who Patrick Pierce was, if you know who Michael Collins was, then you understand why the building is named Poet and the Patriot, and why we should have politics in the pub night there. If we could go ahead and roll tape on that Melzer clip, and then yes, please throw us your questions in the chat as we get ready to welcome back Sean O'Brien.
I found a man who had been hunted for a decade. I found documents that illustrated profound corruption in the judicial system, that the judicial system had actually been abused to persecute a man, to push him into a corner, and to intimidate everybody else in the world who could perhaps have the dangerous idea of copying the methods of WikiLeaks and actually inform the public about government and what they're doing with the tax money that is paid to them and the power that is delegated to them. And the deeper I got into this case, the more profoundly I was shocked at how Western democracies have lost their course. I'm not saying we don't have rule of law in Britain and in Sweden and in the US and all the other Western countries in cases that don't threaten establishment power. But as soon as that power is threatened, we do not have the rule of law. I investigated this case, and sometimes I'm being told, well, you're overstepping the line, this has nothing to do with torture. I'm asking, how does it not have anything to do with torture when a man exposes evidence for war crimes and torture and rape, and no one is being prosecuted for that? How is that not a violation of the prohibition of torture?
So I saw a comment in the chat from Martin O'Connor. Martin, it's always good to see you. And it is actually amazing that someone of Melzer's standing cannot get any governments to listen to him. You did address that specifically in the interview that that Mohammed Almazi conducted. Mohammed, thank you for the super chat. I think it's a first where we've had a guest come back in and give us a super chat. I'm a little bit blown away. Thank you very much. If you read Mohammed's reporting, Martin, and you watch the interview, Melzer specifically addressed the fact that he is being flat out ignored. The UK hasn't even, I believe, and somebody fact check me on this in the chat if I'm right, but I believe the UK has not even responded to Nils Melzer yet on his report, on his subsequent nudging for an answer. The US has the largest, deafest ears imaginable when it comes to our own human rights violations. And specifically countries that don't belong to the Five Eyes, they are reacting to this. They are taking note of this. They are speaking about it. For it to go to the Parliamentary Assembly of the Council of Europe and for them to put forth a resolution stating Julian Assange by name and the need for some action on this, that in and of itself says to me that there are individual people within government who are listening to Nils Melzer, and they're taking steps to pressure their own people into listening to Nils Melzer and moving forward on just some serious discussions about torture, some serious discussions about prisoner treatment, some serious discussions about the Julian Assange case overall. The last several vigils, we've had guests mention a feeling of, more a feeling of hope in terms of pressure being mounted to keep Julian Assange from extradition. It does, I know that I get cynical, but it does really feel like there is a global movement building, more so now certainly than any time that I have seen before, in terms of awareness, in terms of people who are in positions of authority or semi-authority, to where they're actually standing up, taking note, and speaking out about this. Is that a question from you, Andrew, or a question from the chat?
It's just in the chat. I was reading it too.
You want to go ahead and field that, or Taylor, Christy? I don't know, I've been talking for a little bit. I can shut up.
So, no, it was just unrelated. I'm just looking at it right now. So yeah, like Steve was saying, we're seeing some more here, and with in particular, and that's inspiring. But there's still a lot of work that needs to be done, of course, and there's still a lot. So again, showing support, donating to WikiLeaks, donating to Chelsea Manning, as we are waiting for our next guest to arrive. I just again want to thank everybody who has donated to our GoFundMe. It's very
Yeah,
helpful.
we had Patrick
We have more?
Flood
Okay.
step in with a super chat. He gave us 420 for the tip jar.
Thank
I
you.
appreciate it. Thank you very much, sir.
Yes, thank you to everybody who has donated. It's so appreciated. It really is.
I don't know if we want to talk about what the money has gone towards already, if we want to break it down a little bit for people. We do want to be very transparent about how we use this money. Right now, we have all been able to book our transportation essentially to our locations. And right now, we've been getting lodging set up. And once we are finished with that, these last remaining dollars that we're hoping to fundraise for in these last couple of weeks, like I mentioned before, we will be working with others in London. And Taylor, I don't know if you want to talk about that a little bit more, but things like camera equipment and having the ability to stream. We want to be streaming between London and DC every day. And bringing you guys kind of a handoff as one day ends and the other begins. And then in DC, we want to pay for things, printing things and handing pamphlets out to people, and things like banners and posters. All that stuff costs money. So if we can have, reaching our goal is really just going to help us pay for the essentials. And really, that was always our goal, was to be able to at least get us there and get us our transportation and our lodging paid for, because like we've said numerous times, that we're doing this in our own time. We're not getting paid. This is all volunteer. And so you guys are helping getting us there in every way possible. And we just really thank you for all of your help. And we really want to bring you as much content as we can throughout that week in both locations.
That's exactly right. And we also, yes, while we're in London, we of course are going to be filming, we're going to be live streaming, and we want to make sure that this is quality coverage. So we are considering renting out equipment while we're in London, because of course we don't want to have audio issues. I know many of you, and I'll take this criticism, were not unhappy with the audio on my latest interview because it was filmed off of my phone. You really couldn't make out, at times, you couldn't really make out what we were saying. So I want to make sure that that does not happen this time, and it will not happen. So donations will go towards things like that, equipment, which is essential, and also to back stateside posters and those sorts of things and materials that are necessary for a demonstration. So our next guest, Sean O'Brien, I did see him pop in here for a second, but we did lose him. So yes, he is our next guest, and I think we'll just wait for him. Steve and I are going to be working with Tarek Haddad, and we are all going to be uploading our work onto our own separate channels, and then also on A4A's channel. And then Tariq has more of a writing background in journalism, like print journalism, so I think he's going to be writing quite a bit. And yes, we will be able to really have some cool information for you guys. And what I mean by that is like in different mediums. So you'll be able to consume this news in a variety of ways, which is important to us. And again, I mean, it's a really unfortunate thing that we have to cover, that we are faced with, but it's important that we get this message out. And then I think we're going to be having like a podcast, just answering questions, and be pretty relaxed, just answering your questions about what happened through the day, what the atmosphere was like. I think Tarek will be able to get into the courtroom. Steve and I are not going to get into the courtroom, and never intended to do so, but he might be able to.
Yeah, I want to make
we'll have that
it
perspective
clear
as well.
that we weren't setting out to take away space in the courtroom from Julian's friends and family, or people that have been dedicated to this for much longer than Action for Assange has existed. We knew going in that unless they moved it to the largest room in Westminster, we weren't going to have a snowball's chance in hell of getting inside in the first place. Where we come in is being the lone U.S. independent media presence that we're aware of. And I'm sure there will be some bigger names there. I've heard that Chris Hedges may be there, but he's through RT, which is, obviously reports outside of the U.S. mainstream narrative, but is not itself an independent media outlet. So that's our goal. That's what we want to do. And we want to be able to deliver on the ground coverage of what's going on outside of Belmarsh Prison. We want to be able to have interviews with the activists and organizers who have been on the ground there for months. It's what journalism is supposed to be. It's what media is supposed to be. And we don't see it here in this country nearly often enough for us to put this together with your help, by the way. And thank you very much for everyone who has donated and the people who have donated regularly. For the four of us to be putting on, the events in DC and what we're planning on doing in London, to me, at least, is a testimony to the lack of integrity, give a damn quality in U.S. media as a whole. I don't know how you guys feel about that. You can chime in.
I mean, a lot of it has to do with the U.S. media in the broad brush is just owned by intelligence communities or subservient to the state. It's something that everyone's known for a really long time. It's not like our media apparatus is the best thing here. But what really troubles me and what I hope to see more of is the independent media just stop playing the horse race games and stop covering the things that are designed to distract people from the real issues, like Julian's extradition trial. So there's tons of news that come out about it. And I think maybe part of it is we're not doing a good enough job in releasing it in short clips in digestible ways, because people aren't going to spend a couple hours watching a vigil to get the news in between the larger interview and hard-hitting segments that we do too. So hopefully we can participate more in creating this change within independent media by putting these news clips forward. But ultimately what I hope is that a lot of these creators just take the initiative on their own to research this information and start putting out accurate information about Julian's case, because there wasn't even much that circulated when the prisoners rose up and got him out of solitary confinement. I heard barely a peep about it. And that's just, to me, it's disheartening, because the independent media, the YouTubers, the people that write the articles, they're supposed to be the frontline people in reporting about this. But instead, we just get inundated with craziness about Biden this and Warren that and Trump this. And I just hope that we can reach a time as the independent media where we move past it, because a lot of what it sounds like now is just reiterating the bullshit that we already know exists from the mainstream sphere.
Well, I believe that people independent in independent media are going to be covering this full extradition hearing once we're there. I do believe that they will, and we also are very happy to be a source of their information on this case, and we're very open to doing that. I believe that they will cover this, and we've seen some people who do cover the candidates quite a bit, who have gone out of their way to ask them every single time, even with like graphics there, do you support Julian Assange? And that's the Convo Couch. Pasta and Fiorella have done that. And I really appreciate that they've taken that initiative. They have great coverage of the election. I think they're headed to New Hampshire today, actually. They've really taken an effort to ask the candidates about this, which is so cool. And that's exactly what we want to do, is we want to inspire people to talk about Julian and kind of have it mesh in with their own coverage as well. And they've done that, which is really cool. So I believe, of course, once this extradition hearing has begun on February 24th, we'll hear more about it.
What independent creators covered the UC Global case, aside from like the CN Lives of the world? Do we know? Because I haven't seen much in the pop up from the headlines of other creators that are covering these kinds
Patrick
of
Henningsen.
things.
And his outlet has covered UC Global. I think Mint Press did an article on it. I am almost 100% sure that both Canary and Sputnik covered it. Canary is definitely the more independent outlet of the two, but Sputnik is incredible in terms of getting us information that we wouldn't ordinarily get.
Yeah, Sputnik has done a really good job of covering Julian's situation. I interviewed with them multiple times on behalf of Unity of wanting to release information accurately about this case. I do just want to take a quick moment. We have had a few more donations. We had a $50 anonymous donation. Thank you to whoever that was, and to Paul Fana, who gave us $100. Thank you so much. We are now less than $200 away from our ultimate goal. So you guys, we're so close to this weekend. This is amazing. I'm so glad that we have had people support us all the way through, and just yeah, thank you to the most recent donations.
So Sean is about 5 minutes out, he says. He was having some issues with his one computer, switched over to the next one. He's installing Zoom right now. So we will have him on as soon as technology enables it. But the thing that I want to talk about here, while we have a little bit. Thank you, Kevin. That's actually who I was going to shout out, among other things. I want to just let everyone in the intelligence agency know that's currently watching our stream that you can be a whistleblower too. You can stand up for free speech. You can release information that proves the guilt of our government. And there is institutions and infrastructure built around the world to support you. So any members of the CIA, NSA, MI6, FBI that are watching right now, all it takes is one action of courage, and all of the horrible things in the past that you've done can start to be forgiven, essentially. So I just encourage anyone in a position to release information to please do so. Because what the world needs now more than anything is more whistleblowers and more publishers and more journalists. So I hope that through our efforts here, with hopefully the surveillance that we do or don't have by these agencies, that someone within it will get a change of heart, essentially. So.
Yeah, no, absolutely. If you're not just Kevin, but any other agent who may be monitored the test this day, or anybody else's, yeah, if you have come to realize through your day job, what you get paid for to monitor this, that the organization you work for may not be on the right side of the angels, now's the time. It really is. We are going into an enormous press freedom trial that has global implications that will, honestly, and I don't want to sound like I'm sensationalizing anything or being any kind of hyperbolic when I say this, but it would literally change the face of journalism, and how publishers operate and what journalists are able to do indefinitely. And I don't know if setting a global precedent can be overturned. You could do it in individual countries, but let's say that, for example, there's somebody reports on what Saudi Arabia does, or somebody says that, look, the Chinese crackdown on the Uyghurs has a lot more to do with stemming the spread of Wahhabism than it does with any sort of racist tendency. That person can be prosecuted in another country because of the precedent that this was set. Whatever government gets embarrassed can now go after who embarrassed them if this is allowed to take place. And that's why I get so agitated about it. That's why I think it's so necessary to do this. Sean, if you can hear us, go ahead and give us a shout, and we'll be more than happy to introduce you.
Hey, you can hear me?
Woohoo!
Yeah.
Good. Sorry about all that.
Yeah, Sean, finally we got you on. Thank you so much for joining us. For our viewers, Sean is a lecturer at Yale Law School. He is a friend of our vigils. He has been on before. I believe it was our episode on Halloween and then the week prior. So thank you again for joining us once again. I know that you did just recently write an article about press freedoms, and it was actually published in the privacy issue. And you chose to write about 5 specific press cases. And I want you to provide us with sort of your criteria for choosing these specific 5 journalists to highlight in this article.
Sure. So show a sort of continuing thread that goes through a number of different cases. Obviously, there are organizations that are constantly doing these huge overviews of, or annually doing usually, but doing these huge overviews of press repression in the global south, in countries like Saudi Arabia, which was one of the countries I picked, but also in places like China and so on. And biting off all that, trying to put it in an article and trying to, communicate general overview stuff was not really what I was interested in. I want to make sure that I had just a few cases which were very poignant, which are very important for people to be aware of now, because some of them you can take action on, right? And I just wanted to show the role of technology, especially cybercrime prosecution, and sort of the continuing thread, which, for better or for worse, to some people, is U.S. dominance, right? The attack on Glenn Greenwald recently in Brazil, where Bolsonaro's government basically tried to prosecute him with a cybercrime for doing reporting on corruption there. Obviously, that's very closely related to his prior work. He's done, obviously, a ton of investigative reporting, but most well known for the Snowden disclosures, right? Snowden himself in exile, et cetera, et cetera. So then I went through some of the larger countries which have a role. The United States, talked about Chelsea Manning. Chelsea Manning, as I'm sure a lot of the viewers know, is now in prison again. And she's in prison for refusing to testify in a upcoming case, they think, against Julian Assange. So she said, all the information that I gave before is the information I have. I can't give you new testimony, and was hit with a ton of fees, ridiculous fees for every day that she refused to testify. So because she can't pay those fees, she's back in prison again. And it remains to be seen what the outcome of that case is going to be. But obviously, that's something we need to make sure we support Chelsea, and especially concerning, the link to WikiLeaks and Julian. It's a big deal. Now, before I get into Julian, because that's obviously what your viewers know the most about here, or most concerned about, the reason they're listening, I did want to just say the report that Amnesty put out about Saudi Arabia, I don't mean to sort of gloss over it and say it's not a big deal, because it is. There was a lot of uproar last year and a little before about the death of Jamal Khashoggi, which was terrible, right? But there's also a lot of press repression that's happening through something called these. So they have what's basically something similar to a FISA court-ish, which FISA being the secret court in the United States, that has an anti-terror mandate, right? This specialized criminal court is a Saudi Arabian version of that. And they've expanded their definition of counterterrorism to include cybercrime. So basically, any journalist using a computer for any sort of investigative reporting, any sort of human rights work, any sort of activism is going to be prosecuted as a terrorist if they can do it. Some of this has been, some Women to Drive campaign, for example, which is a big deal, right? In a country that repressive, I should say, it's a big deal that women have some mode of getting around, being able to empower themselves through work, et cetera, and not having to rely on necessarily a man driving them around. That level of autonomy is a big deal, and a lot of the activists involved in that movement are now in trouble with this SEC court.
So Sean, before we do move on into Julian's case, I do want you to, in a greater depth, explain your choice to also include New Zealand in this list, and to also talk about that case in particular. Susie Dawson is someone that I work with, and others on this vigil work with as well, Christy in particular. So I want to know why you chose to highlight her case, and then if you could explain too, through a cyber perspective, why this is so important that we be talking about this case and why we should
Sure.
be.
So Susie's case is interesting and I think very accessible and understandable to a lot of folks. Normally, when you hear about press repression, you're not talking about the fallout that can happen from just the fear, right, of being murdered or, you know, having your family attacked or something else happening with your personal welfare. We tend to talk about surveillance, targeted surveillance, mass dragnet surveillance, in terms of things like that. And I can also be pretty guilty of that sometimes myself. Susie's case shows that someone can be completely harassed, have all kinds of attacks happen to her, be fearful for her own safety, and then have to flee her own home country just to make sure that nothing happens to her family. So Susie Dawson, she roughly from a time period of 2011 to 2015, and she's documented this very well. She had a number of incidents that were threats on her safety, and also just technological stuff, right? The types of things we find out later are targeted surveillance or targeted attacks on our technology. But at the time, maybe some of the viewers are like, well, that thing might not be working, right? I experienced some of these things myself. So anyway, she went to Russia. She's a resident in Russia right now. She's still been doing incredible reporting, doing incredible interviews.
I want to interject really quickly. She's actually not a resident of Russia right now. She is re-seeking asylum there at this time.
I should clarify. She's residing in Russia looking for asylum. Yes, that is correct, right? So her asylum case is going to cost a lot of money. She needs that kind of support. She needs both monetary support and then just people talking about her case. So I wanted to make sure that people knew about it. Not everything is about people, being rounded up and thrown into camps, right? There are a lot of cases where there's a chilling effect on journalists. Susie is courageous enough to still be visible, still be vocal, and so on and so forth. But there are a lot of folks who get scared shitless, pardon my English, and never report again, have to go into hiding, and are not able to, obviously do the kind of reporting that we need as a free society. So Susie's case is a great example of that. For my own part, I think it was a good way to cap off the article. We went through the United States, we went through the UK with Julian's case, and I think people really need to be aware of what goes on with the Five Eyes surveillance, or the information sharing agreement, as they call it. The Five Eyes states, which are US, Britain, Australia, Canada, and New Zealand. Those countries have dragnet surveillance dominated by the US intelligence agencies, and are constantly working together to suppress any dissidents, any version of an actual free press in this case. They do all kinds of domestic and foreign spying. And in this case, the long arm of the United States reaches into New Zealand. Now, of course, Kim.com, right? Huge fame for Mega Upload, right? He also, is facing all kinds of prosecution by the United States. And it remains to be seen what happens in that case. Susie has been very vocal about that. I know Kim has come on to some of these vigils and so on. So there's a lot of linkages there. I just wanted to make sure I highlighted.
So if you could
thank
for a
you.
minute.
I just want to say thank you for highlighting that specifically, and also clarifying the significance of the Five Eyes and their power internationally.
Yeah.
While we have you on, we were just discussing before you came in, the UK's new live facial recognition system, and I was just wondering what your opinion of facial recognition is, and if you could talk a little bit about the entire like infrastructure and system that kind of surrounds that.
Sure. So I actually briefly mentioned in the article UK's facial recognition, specifically because the UK has a long history of surveilling with CCTV cameras, right? They are pioneers in this area. They have more of, any what we would traditionally call Western state surveilled with cameras than probably any other country, although things are changing pretty swiftly. Um, the facial recognition component that they're rolling out through the Met Police and also through other entities, right? Doing it very silently. They're actually ticketing people. So if they put a sign up somewhere temporarily, or they have a van somewhere temporarily, and they say, we're using facial recognition. If you try to cover your face, and I linked to one of these videos in the piece, you can get a fine. Obviously, more than just a fine is what ends up applying. You get harassed by the police, you get interviewed. I'm sure you get your name on a list. I'm sure your facial information is much more interesting to them after you've taken the step of trying to hide it. So, that's a big deal. Facial recognition technology, FRT, which I've started to call it, and I hope that acronym sticks because it's a lot easier to say. FRT is extremely problematic. I think most folks are quite aware that their face is a very private, aspect of what we call biometrics, right? Their identification, and having massive coordinated databases of face characteristics is, as close as we get to a technological totalitarian globe as you can imagine. The rollout so far in the United States has been spotty, mostly dominated by private companies, as it tends to be. There are a lot of municipalities that are starting to automatically categorize people as potentially dangerous or criminals using facial recognition. The algorithms, the decision making behind those systems has been shown over and over and over again to be extremely biased. It tends to be biased against the parts of society that always get screwed over. So, Blacks, Latinos, Muslim groups, and so on, they tend to be the ones who the bias is against. And that's probably partially a little bit of the bias of the people who make the technology, and partially because there's some challenges with the technology itself. It's not that good in a lot of ways, right?
So you had talked a little bit about how the UK uses the technology to ticket their citizens and surveil them, and if someone tries to resist it, they step in with more force.
Yep.
How is that? Well, do you think that that in any way is different than the Chinese social credit score system? And is that something that's just been slow rolled out in the UK, and people just aren't allowed to see what their social credit number is relative to their relationship to government?
Yeah, so my greatest fear, and the thing I guess I should say about facial recognition technology, but also all of these other technologies that are starting to be rolled out and combined and correlated, um, is exactly that, some kind of social credit score. If you go to one of the major cities in China, even if you're not a Chinese citizen, you can be automatically, flagged for doing certain actions. You can be discriminated against with pricing and all kinds of things, with hiring and et cetera, just by cameras. So they are doing very, very serious facial recognition combined with the thing you're calling the social credit score, which basically limits or allows higher social mobility in the culture. In the UK and in the United States and in Europe, I'm not quite sure how this is going to play out. It would not surprise me if there is something similar to a social credit score sort of starting to bubble up inside the government.
Oh yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. No, if you watch our friend and sometimes streaming partner Jason Burmis at all, he'll discuss how social credit is already here at length. I tend to agree with him. We the amount of battery you have on your phone affects your actual credit score. But we see in a number of ways, through online censorship, through deplatforming, through what you're allowed to say in the digital sphere, that a form of social credit is taking place because you're elevated. You get a blue check. You get, you get this. You get to hide who replies onto your threads. You get to, encourage people to mass report and get away with it, rather than the lowly among us trying to stand up and fight back. And not only that, but we have fucking pre-crime now.
Of course.
Sean O'Brien,
Yes.
would you like to talk to the audience a little bit about Bill Barr's pre-crime division? Are you familiar enough with it?
I don't know if I'm familiar enough to go into detail. I know there are some folks who are working very hard on that stuff in the United States. There's a project called Perpetual Lineup that talks a lot about this, combines it with facial recognition technology. Just to your point, though, I'm not sure how centrally coordinated this stuff is yet. I think we're going to get there, which is really scary. I do think the implementation is sort of spotty. You've got private databases that are spying on people. You've got some municipal databases that are spying on people. And then you have the kinds of things you're talking about where if you apply for certain jobs, you may or may not get them because you said the F word on a Twitter post 5 years ago. There's actually a company which name escapes me that's recently been in the spotlight for this, where someone was able to get their report from this company while they were applying for a job, and they got 351 pages of
I saw that. Yeah, I can't remember the name.
Those kinds of things are happening. Whether or not it becomes a centralized sort of, it's these are different states, these are different power structures. Maybe it doesn't have to be. We should be very scared of it anyway, right? Just because it's not looking us in the face the same way you would expect from a Soviet or a Chinese, that kind of power, doesn't mean that it's not an influence on our lives. And I'm sure it massively is. So yeah. Now, as far as pre-crime goes, yeah, I mean, they're trying to flag individuals for being problematic pixels online through the things they've done in the past, and then potentially something that's very close to eugenics, as far as I can tell, which is just figuring out that criminals have certain types of faces or certain types of characteristics, and then putting those in databases. They're looking at things not just facial recognition, but they might be looking at, clothing style. I've heard rumor of, and I can't verify, that these cameras are also looking at people's gait, which is the way that people walk. That's traditionally been used by the FBI and the CIA and so on, to not only identify an individual that they may be looking for and separate them from a crowd, but also it's been used sort of in this, like I'm saying, eugenics way, where they say, well, miscreants walk this way with their hands in their pockets and bent over.
Yeah, it's digital phrenology.
Right.
It's basically.
So on the idea of the someone's pacing and their gait, there's actually been studies that have come out and shown that you can tie someone's the way someone walks directly to the city that they were from. And every city has their own unique pace and walking style, much like an accent. So that could also be a way to essentially do like an almost genetic geolocation of where you came from. So I think pointing that out is really important too, because those data tables are there for people from Indiana walk like this if they're from Indianapolis, or this if they're from Bloomingdale. So those data sets exist already.
Yeah, and this is one of the reasons I like coming on here, because you guys are also extremely knowledgeable, and being able to coordinate with you and learn new things is great. What's important about that case you just said is that there's going to be surprise even yet know about, that are going to come through this technology. So when somebody says, hey, we're just putting up traffic cams, as they do in my city here, New Haven, we're not doing facial recognition, we're not doing this other stuff. Well, they are storing all this footage. This footage is going to these cloud vendors. Who the hell knows how they're coordinating them, storing them, etc. There's very little transparency about that. that data can be used to create machine learning sets that do things like you said, like find that there's unique characteristics for people in New Haven, and here's exactly what they do. So now when I go to, you know, San Francisco or wherever, Montreal or whatever, they'll know who I am from a distance. Before we get completely off of the facial rec, the big story of the month, at least in the US, was Clearview AI, which is a massive private database of facial recognition profiles, basically. This is the first major private centralization of databases that we're aware of. That also is being used actively by hundreds of police entities in the United States. So there's a public-private partnership that's very strong there. Now, I have heard, and I'm not sure we know yet, that some of the claims that they make about the strength of the technology are false. But they do claim that even if they have like blurry faces or, you know, half shadowed faces and things like that, that they still can identify people. So it's getting scary. I mean, it is scary, but it's getting scarier. So yeah. Yep.
Oh no, we can stay on Clearview for a moment, because that's kind of related to what we were just talking about in terms of the digital phrenology. Like, you can write an algorithm for it that just looks for specific types of faces, and
Right.
based off of what Clearview already provides, that would infinitely increase your you know, the amount, I'm saying this all wrong, would equally decrease the amount of time you spend on trying to identify a subject or a group of subjects. It really, I said it earlier in the vigil, but it really is a tool of terrorism in order to gain and manipulate the control over your populace that you have. The general citizenry knows that they're being monitored all the time, and that the technology is such is that their Facebook picture from 3 years ago through this company Clearview and partnering with law enforcement is what can identify them. We don't have a statute of limitations on a lot of crimes in a post-Patriot Act era, you know, so if need be, if you say something out of line or that the government doesn't like, they can use existing technology to backtrack and find out what you were doing, you know, a couple of years ago, and use that to come and charge you.
Right. And I think a lot of these crimes that are being prosecuted as anti-terror, especially, like you said, there's no statute of limitations on any of this stuff. What it means to, quote unquote, gain unauthorized access to a computer system is changing and getting more loose. So, you know, something any of us did 10 years ago could be considered breaking into a computer and, quote unquote, hacking. So those kinds of crimes at the moment are the ones that I think are at the forefront of this. But, you know, marginalized communities that are always screwed over are going to be the ones who I think who are most affected. Surprise, surprise. Not only is it going to hurt social mobility, et cetera, it's going to make it near impossible for some of these folks to participate in the democratic process. Which is why, although law and policy and all that stuff matters to an extent, we really need to be thinking about this from a grassroots and implementation standpoint. Because if we don't start making surveillance technology a big part of what we do, then we're in trouble. So, yeah.
So if we could kind of use this as a way to transition into our next topic. Speaking of democratic rights and technology and all of these things, there was some information that you wanted to talk about in regards to an app that was recently in the news.
Yeah, so I don't know if I don't know which one you're talking about. Are we talking about the Pegasus NSO group stuff?
Oh, I was talking about the Iowa caucus.
Oh, the Iowa
And
caucus.
yeah, I was trying to.
But
Okay.
we can get into Pegasus after that if you want to.
Absolutely.
For sure.
Yeah, sure. So let's talk about that real quick. The Iowa app's interesting because it's just a bad implementation of democracy. And also, just I guess for the listeners real quick, the only old mention of this that goes into any detail is in the Podesta email archive. So that must be the the relationship there. When I went digging into the Iowa app, it's not necessarily awful, right? It's just really badly implemented. So yeah. At any rate, lost my train. Okay, the NSO Group and the Pegasus. The NSO Group is a Israeli firm that does what intelligence agencies do, right? They break into things, they do targeted surveillance, they harass journalists, and so on and so forth. And so the NSO Group has been implicated in surveillance of activists in the UAE, the United Arab Emirates, and the group that investigated that and was first talking about it was Citizen Lab in Toronto. After they released information on that, the UAE, of course, denied that it ever happened. And then Citizen Lab, right, the people there were now being targeted by this technology that was attacking their cell phones. Pegasus makes it possible to intercept phone calls, texts, et cetera, basically pwns your phone and can own your phone. And it can be injected via text message. So it's very easy to do what we would traditionally call a phishing attack via email just by sending a malicious text to someone. So NSO Group now, they're operating all over the place. It's not just in the Middle East. The Jamal Khashoggi case, which I talked a little bit about, NSO Group had something to do with the surveillance on him, but also in the UK and in the United States, we're starting to see some evidence that the surveillance is being used. So you have an Israeli firm with international ties, a lot of ties to US business and US money, doing targeted surveillance, in the United States, in the UK. And there was just a very major story about that published today, but also there was a New York Times journalist who was targeted by Pegasus, which is the tool of the NSO that's most prominent, a few weeks ago. So journalists are getting attacked, and we'll see. I may do a piece specifically about that, and then also the types of targeted attacks that were revealed by the Vault 7 and Vault 8 disclosures that WikiLeaks did. So.
And please come back on Slow News Day to have that conversation too with my audience. When you're done with the piece and it's out, please let me know, or I'll get a hold of you, because I always enjoy it when you're on the show.
Awesome. Absolutely awesome.
And so does my audience misses you, by the way. I occasionally get messages like, you need to have Sean back. We learned way too much last time, and we're due to have our brain hurt again.
I need to do more. Yeah, absolutely. As you both know, there's so much to cover, so I have a tendency to sort of cast the net widely and go all over the place. So yeah, more appearances would help with that, because then I can start drilling deeper into certain things. Sure.
Hell yeah.
Awesome.
If you could for a minute, I know we talked about it last time, but what are some just simple changes that people could do with their everyday tech habits that would make them more secure and less susceptible to dragnet technology?
Sure. So everyday habits, first off, social media, as we know, is a huge problem from a private surveillance standpoint. But also social media tends to be a way in which governments are able to sort of backdoor their populations. We don't know the extent that a lot of these companies are working with government entities at any one time, but they always do. Often that's in the terms of service that you sign up for, right? The Tor network is a huge tool that I recommend to people to protect yourself from dragnet surveillance. That allows you to go online and have real anonymity. So if you download Tor browser, you use that to browse the web. That will really decrease the attack surface, right? That you're creating for these dragnet rings, basically. VPNs are also still a good technology. Your mileage may vary on any specific VPN. Just be very careful, because VPNs are often not what they seem. So there have been a number of cases where VPNs are either collecting information on their users without telling you, or telling you up front, but it's just very hidden, or their data practices are not really wonderful. So you've got to do your homework on that. I tend not to recommend a specific VPN, but it is a technology that has helped a lot of people and is very popular in places where you can't use Tor without flagging yourself as being some sort of radical and terrorist, et cetera, right? Whatever they want to call people these days. So if you can't use Tor, use a VPN. Using a Tor and a VPN together is often a really good thing. So, you can get a VPN, dial into it on your laptop. If you have an Android phone, you can also do that on your phone. And then you can open Tor browser. And so now you've got the doubly shielded technology. That means that if your VPN provider is doing something that's a little shady that you're not aware of, at least they're not going to get your web browsing history, right? At least they're not going to know what you're doing through the web. So yeah, if you can get off social media, do. If you can't, you need to compartmentalize your life a little bit and just think about what's going into those networks and try to keep it separate, right? Compartmentalized. Tor or VPN, now you're taking steps to make sure that the information you're reading about or, sending to other people or posting online, you're harder to track as you do that. That's not going to be perfect from keeping you, safe. We do a long piece on the privacy issue, which is where we have that article about press freedom, about some more detailed things you can do to avoid dragnet surveillance. In that, we have some pretty basic stuff like just making sure you have good password techniques and strategies. So we have a couple strategies for coming up with random passwords and passphrases. And we say, really, if you can use an offline password manager, not one of these ones that's stored somewhere in some amorphous cloud, but something that's stored locally on your device, then use that. That's very helpful. Searching with a search engine that is more trustworthy is big. I do recommend DuckDuckGo in this respect. They're going to be the best balance of really useful features and more private. There are some other alternatives as well. And there's... Yep.
Are there any that don't use Google as the back end? Because I know DuckDuckGo does.
So where did you get that info? Because
like 3 different people have explained this to me, and
listen, it doesn't matter. I'm not trying to put you on the spot, but if there is something about that, I need to know about it because I recommend DuckDuckGo a lot. My understanding is that DuckDuckGo gets a cache of information from a number of different entities, then creates its own back end from that information.
Okay.
So they get data from Bing, I believe. They get data from some other search engines. And then, sorry about my dog.
All good. We like dogs. Commander X was on the other week and he made a point to put his dog on camera and everyone's heart melted. So, or at least mine did. And that's a rare freaking thing.
But yeah, no, he's a little bit too big for me to hold up in front of the camera. But at any rate, yeah, so I'd like to know about that. But yeah, like I said, they create a number of internal databases that they're in charge of, so, and they grab that information from other private entities. So my understanding is there's no reason to think that your information is going to anyone else but DuckDuckGo.
Man, now it's killing me to try and remember who was telling me that.
Okay, well, there's 2 others that usually, and I guess we should plug, especially if there's some uncertainty about this. One is StartPage, which merged with a search engine called XQuick a little while ago. That's very popular. That's also European based. So whether or not you think your data is actually a little bit safer in Europe, I'm never really too sure of that. Given the long reach of the United States, as we know, especially into countries like Germany and of course Britain. But anyway, StartPage is a good option, and there's Quant, QWANT in France, which is very popular. When I recommend these things, I try to think about whether someone is going to continue to use them. And I would say of the two, of StartPage and Quant, Quant probably has the more robust features. It's got a nice image search and nice video search and things like that. I do know that, you know, if you start telling people to use some of the more, you know, the hackery stuff, the geek stuff, the stuff that I try to use, then it's you're less likely to keep them using it. So yeah, so finding a better search engine and getting out of Google as much as possible is important. Making sure you're using Tor is big, making sure you're using VPN is big, but then communication, right? So trying to use end-to-end encrypted technology when talking to people is also extremely important. And there are a lot more options than there used to be. There can be a lot of uncertainty about these products. I still use Signal a lot. I still use a product called Wire as well. I'll also use something called Matrix, which you can get at riot.im. That's like a decentralized chat technology. And then there's still encrypted email. There's still encrypted chat, right? That resembles normal IM chat and things like that. But those tend to be more of a pain to set up. And then one more thing I guess I would recommend real quick. Sending files can be a pain, right? And OnionShare, onionshare.org allows you to set up a temporary Tor Dropbox, basically, where people can either upload files to you or you can upload files for other people to download. And if they have Tor browser, they fire that up. They go out to the address that you create with OnionShare. They grab the files. Maybe they give you some files. And then you can make the whole thing self-destruct. So technologies that are temporary, that are only on the network for a short amount of time, are also extremely valuable. In this case, you're using Tor, so there's a lot less to worry about than the normal web. But even if you can find ways, strategies to post things on the normal web, and then you can make them self-destruct or disappear quickly, obviously you're increasing the chances that you're not going to be surveilled. You're making it harder for your tracks to be followed because the thing's not up there for very long. So using a basket of technologies, sharing the information as securely as possible, not relying on, you know, Twitter DM and so on and so forth, which sometimes it's the only way to reach out, or sometimes it's perfectly appropriate to reach out over those technologies, but don't have the illusion that your conversation isn't being tracked when you use them, right? And yeah.
And I want to point out to the people in the audience right now, because we're and big shout out to Gordon Dimmick and people of the 99% for being streaming partners today. But all of this might seem a little bit complicated at first, but it's literally just using a different messaging app and a different browser from the most basic level. The Tor browser is nothing more than just another internet browser you type things into. Same thing with DuckDuckGo. It's just another search engine. So I think that's really important to mention too, because in everything seems as complex of a topic as it is. For the end user, it's as easy as just downloading a different application and then saying, hey, friend of mine, could you download this too? It's a really cool messaging app. And then you can spread and proliferate encrypted technology among your friends simply by saying, hey, why have you checked out this app? It doesn't let the CIA know what we're talking about.
Yep. And so I have a PDF I'll make sure that we link to and tweet and so on of the stuff we do in workshops. When we do workshops, we tend to remix it based on the crowd and based upon feedback. So the materials I'll make sure everyone has available to them are pretty dense, but you know, like you said, you just cherry pick from it. You create a basket of technologies. The best thing to do, especially, is to do it with a friend or a few friends. So you're now using the same technology. And if you have any issues, you can sort of bounce things off of each other. But also, you're actively creating a use case for you there. You're not just alone somewhere figuring this stuff out by yourself. And then, you know, it's communication technology. It's better to do it in a group. And whatever the strategy you come up with, even just taking that step of actively sitting down, thinking about it, trying to come up with better solutions is a really empowering thing that we need to be doing more of. So, you know, and sometimes you're going to screw up a little bit. So you get better at doing what they call threat modeling, right? Where you say, hey, maybe we shouldn't be doing this. because the level of the information, the level of the secrets that we're sharing has increased dramatically because now we're also involved in this, right? So that sort of thing's big. One thing I just want to point out before I go, and this is a very minor plug, I've been working on these little mini hardware computers for a while about things like secure file sharing and so on. We're going to be shipping our first development kits this month. I'm not going to tell everybody to run out and buy them, et cetera, et cetera. But what would be great from your audience would be if they can go out to a survey we have with one question to fill out. We want to know if people would buy something that would tell you on a nice little dashboard, right, whether or not your devices were spying on you and who that information is going to. So if you had a little thing on the wall or something you could carry around like a tablet that told you that Google was grabbing information from your phone at that moment and how much information and likely what country that information is going to or countries, is that something that people would be interested in?
I think that is one of the most disruptive technologies that could be proliferated amongst the general public. So I would say absolutely yes if I could fill out that survey.
I wholeheartedly concur with that, Andrew. Yeah, I'll fill out that survey too. I'll put out that information on my show as well because that would be vital technology to me.
Right.
Could you talk
Yep.
Oh, no, go ahead. Go ahead. I can ask it later.
Do these things now from a technological standpoint, but it requires, basically a bunch of hackers, geeks, programmers to daisy chain all this stuff together. As far as I'm aware, no one's ever come out with a product like that. And if I can make it beautiful and get it in people's hands, that would be huge. So
I agree.
Could you talk a little bit more about some of your other commercial endeavors like Secure Drive and those kinds of things?
Sure. So this would also be a product under what I'm calling Privacy Safe. With Privacy Safe, our main drive is to have decentralized file storage. So you don't have to use a cloud provider like iCloud or Dropbox, et cetera. And you can still sync your files and share them with people. So like that thing I was talking about, Onion Share, which you can use in a web browser, this would be a little hardware device that you have. You put on a desk, you put in your basement, your friend has one too, your grandmother has one too. They all talk to each other in sync. They do so using the Tor network. So the addressing we're using, the way that the computers talk to each other is going to be using Tor addressing. So no intermediaries can figure out who owns what data, where the data is originating from, and where it's going. So that's Privacy Safe. That is a secure drive that we're selling. This other thing, like I said, we want to test the waters a little bit with, may become a new product. It may become something we fold into that product and just put a screen on the thing, right? And so on. But I think there's a lot of people clamoring for knowing whether their Amazon Alexa is sending X amount of data packets to Amazon at that very second. And now, of course, I would say throw your Alexa out, but a lot of folks want to, either they're in an environment where they can't get rid of all of the smart devices around them, right? They're in the workplace, they're in whatever, or they don't know what are around them, or for whatever reason, they're willing to make a bit of a trade-off, but they at least, can get some transparency about what the things around them are doing. Obviously, most people using a smartphone are quite aware that these technologies can end up being so ubiquitous that you sort of cut yourself off from the world if you don't use them. We may get there with smart devices too, not just phones in our pockets, but the things all around us. It may be impossible to avoid these things soon. And I'm hoping if we can create sort of an sort of tells you about those other devices and who they're talking to and when, that'll be useful. That kind of stuff we do all the time when we look into Android apps and where the data leakages are as researchers. So I just said, let's put this in a pretty package if we can do it.
So this might seem like a weird question, but have you thought at all about taking your Secure Drive technology to municipalities and local police and sheriff's departments as a way to, for them to keep their technology safe, but for people in the privacy world as a way to stop mass surveillance potentially?
Yeah, so right now we're still just in the dev kit stage, right? And we still have to prove ourselves both through the technology we have by sharing all the source code, which we'll definitely do. Big supporter of free and open source software. We want our stuff audited, down to the circuitry, basically. So we have to prove ourselves enough to get into those environments. I do think it is useful. So, for example, if I could tell the Department of Transportation in New Haven, which has all these surveillance cameras, well, you know what? If you're going to use them, we want a ban on facial recognition technology. We want you to only use them for traffic, et cetera, et cetera. And, we can offer you this technology so you keep everything in-house. If that's what you mean by that, so that they don't use a cloud vendor and so that stuff doesn't get scooped up by the wider dragnet surveillance, I do think that is useful. As you know, it can be problematic, sort of dancing with the devil. So
I mean more down on the level of like cities storing their data and like a school district storing its kids' data.
Yep.
And a local police department storing its criminal records under something like that.
Exactly. Yeah. So we want that would be great if it's not centralized in some cloud somewhere, and then it can be scooped up, leaked, coordinated, et cetera, et cetera. Right. That would be awesome. We definitely want to roll out to school districts. We're positioning the development kit as a learning primarily for that modules on there that kids can not only just store data on it and get data off of it, but they can dial into it basically and learn about computers. So we want to get those into schools. The technology could be ubiquitous, right? We could have our cake and eat it too. We could have small little mini computers, widely distributed, widely talking to each other in these big, meshes of networks, right? And not talking to this cloud infrastructure that's run by Amazon, run by Google, and then subject to these dragnet surveillance networks that the NSA and the CIA, et cetera, are running. So, yeah, that would be great. Selling that stuff is not as easy, as it sounds. Everyone likes the idea when you talk to them, but there's institutional friction because a lot of these places have already decided that they just go with some cloud vendor and everything's okay. So getting through that is difficult. One of the ways I've been able to have that conversation with people in enterprise and institutional environments is because they're afraid of ransomware. Ransomware waves are hitting like crazy all over the place, especially in school districts and municipalities and so on. And those are the cases we know about. When you actually get down to it and you have a real conversation with people on the ground, they'll be like, oh yeah, we have this thing where it's like erasing our files every other day and then we just restore from some backup we have somewhere. It's like, oh, so that's how you live every day. You go in the morning, your files are going to be gone or locked up and you're not going to be able to get into them. And then you have to reflash all your computers, but people do that, they can operate like that for a really long time, especially in these environments where change is really difficult. So yeah, it'd be awesome if we can get into those environments and prove those use cases in us. But you're asking them to go. I mean, we're going against the tide and we're willing to do it to develop these things, but you're asking them to come along with you. And that's not always easy. So.
And in the case of academia specifically, they're already entrenched in the intelligence community. They're already entrenched with providing information to all branches of law enforcement. So that would be a tough sell in that environment. If you're trying to get it implemented university wise, I can see it becoming a thing with individual teachers, even like satellite or community colleges, way easier than I can say Harvard.
And that's why we want to start small. But I would also say that look. Signal's not the greatest thing that ever happened, right? It uses phone numbers to identify the people you're talking to, but people are using Signal in a widespread way. And if you had talked to somebody in 2012, 2011 and told them to use a technology like that, they would have thought you were crazy. And now that's become ubiquitous and everybody's using it. So it's not impossible to get enough deployment that it just becomes normal. The intelligence community, though, when we get to that level, I don't want to say I'll welcome it because it's going to be a problem, but it will mean that we've been successful, right? The intelligence community will find ways to try to stop the deployment of decentralized networks in any way, shape, or form, because the centralization that they've been able to achieve is the crown jewel right now. And the only question that you hear about in these backdooring encryption debates is, well, are we going to have a backdoor or aren't we going to have a backdoor? The reason that's the only question is the assumption is that they're going to have access to these centralized networks. They're going to have access to Amazon's infrastructure. They're going to have access to Google's infrastructure. But if we can decentralize that infrastructure, right, even if it weren't encrypted well, even if it weren't completely anonymous, but it just weren't held by Amazon, right? If you had a LAN in your school and the LAN is only local for real, it's very hard for someone to get that information without actively putting an intelligence agent on the ground, right? In some way, shape, or form, or putting a device on the network that shouldn't be there, et cetera, et cetera. And there's an expense and a cost tied to that. So, it goes back to the old thing Snowden's always talking about, where it's, increasing the cost of them doing these things. And decentralizing, breaking up the cloud. We were calling our product for a while the anti-cloud, but that tends to confuse people because then you tell people they can share on it, and now the word cloud is so associated with sharing. But anyway, if we can decloud, get rid of those cloud technologies, then that would go a long way in making it difficult for people to be surveilled, at least in places where computer networks are ubiquitous.
And the reason I brought it up in that kind of way about municipalities and things like that, because most of the people on this stream and watching this stream are the small fish in the sea, the average, everyday, normal person. And we try to advocate for decentralized activism, which is not having to have a leader direct you to a protest, but just doing what you can with the time and energy that you have. And part of that is being involved at your city level, being the person willing to have the weird conversation about how our city stores their data. And so I think, like, bringing you on, I'm really grateful that you're building what you are and that we can access it at such an important time right now, as we as a civilization have to build a defense against the global infrastructure of spying, which has already been established.
Yeah, and I'm glad you put it in those terms. So a lot of times when I have these conversations, they don't talk about exactly what you're saying. Doing this think global, act local thing is really, really important. Showing up at meetings at the town and municipal level, showing up at your union's meetings or whatever level of organization in different aspects of your life you can do is really important. And yeah, you can often make real inroads in those areas. And I'd love to see, the technology we're working on implemented in those ways. It's hard. If we can get there, that's great. Let me know if you're interested. So one of the reasons I was plugging the survey is, it only has one question you have to fill out, but if you want to give me more information, we'll reach out to you. I'd like to have some use cases that we can do where we can, let's say we put all this stuff in a school. Let's say we put all this stuff in, a municipality of some kind and roll it out on a wider scale. And then that'll be our beautiful test case of how everybody else can do this. And then we start going wider. That would be huge. And if anyone can help me with that, that would be, obviously I would be very grateful, but also, we would have a very good sort of symbiotic relationship trying to implement that stuff. So.
I can't say that I'm personally in a position to make something like that happen, but I hope that there's enough people out there watching right now that we might get something like that set up for you. So I'll try my best to get into a position where I can make a decision like that or influence a decision like that. So I'll keep you posted.
Awesome. And real quick, Sean, we have a question in the chat about trying to remove Google software from your Android phone. If I recall correctly, when you were on the vigil right before Halloween, you were talking about F-Droid. And I'm not 100% sure that removes all of Google's influence, but I'm like 99% sure. And if you could clarify that for me and for the audience, that would be killer.
Sure. So the two major operating systems are obviously Android and iOS on the iPhone and the iPad. On iOS, it can be very difficult to put anything alternative on there. They've done a really they have very strong locks and keys on what they used to call jailbreaking the phone. So putting that aside for a second, Android phones, you can get certain models of Android phones which will allow you to put your own operating system, your own version of Android on there. And there's a number of these out there that they call ROMs, ROMS, that you can just remove the default operating system that's on there and just put a different version of Android. It'll still have calling and text and email and all that stuff. If you can do that, you've now taken a huge step in removing Google stuff. And then the app store that you would need to use to install software on that device would be F-Droid, f-droid.org. Now, the stuff in F-Droid is all free and open source software. It's checked for tracking technology. So it's run against a database that we contribute to from Yale Privacy Lab that's run by a group called Exodus Privacy. And they have a scanner that looks at Android apps and looks for tracker code in them. So nothing in F-Droid will have these trackers in it verifiably. You can download this stuff, and now you have versions of an email client and a chat client and a browser, and you can get Tor, and you can get all this stuff through F-Droid, which is huge. However, if you can't replace your entire operating system on your Android device, which is often the case for these phones, or you run into problems doing so and it's not working out for you for one reason or another, you can still grab F-Droid and start getting your apps through them instead of Google Play. That will not remove all the googly stuff from your phone, like just wiping your operating system and starting from scratch will. However, it is still a good step in a positive direction. There are often identical versions of the same app in F-Droid that don't have trackers. And a lot of times those are packaged purposefully by researchers and hackers and so on to make sure that those things are in F-Droid. If you grab the same thing out of Google Play, you'd have Google backdooring it, basically. So that's a step in the positive direction. If you do nothing else, install F-Droid and play with it. And then you get a sense for how easy it can be to install your own software.
And
Thank you
so I
very
want to point
much.
something out here. I don't know if you've heard about this news article or not. It came out a little while ago, and you're someone who I feel like can appreciate it more than most. So it got found out that Mohammed bin Salman and the Crown Prince of Saudi Arabia and Jeff Bezos were text buddies, sharing like pictures and videos and all this stuff. And that Mohammed bin Salman, the Crown Prince of Saudi Arabia, actually injected through a video a virus into Jeff Bezos's phone. And they downloaded over a course of a few months about 6 gigabytes of data, and actually had started trying to extort political favors out of Jeff Bezos by using this data. And like they threatened to release dick pics that Jeff Bezos had on there, relationships with his mistress and person that he was cheating on his wife with, and a whole bunch of other things built up in there. So I don't know if you had heard about that, but I knew that you could at least appreciate it because it's probably one of the funniest cybersecurity stories that I've seen in a long time.
Yeah, you know what? I didn't hear about that. I had a friend who ran a recent video called Jeff Bezos's phone, and I just kind of disregarded it. So it must be this story. It came out a couple weeks ago, so that would make sense. I'm looking at it now. But so basically, this looks like they were using Pegasus, which is the tool of the NSO. I can't say that for sure. But that's the kind of thing that Pegasus does. And we know that the Saudi Arabian state has used Pegasus, which comes from this group called the NSO, before to hack people's phones in this way. Like you said, it's a traditional phishing attack, which is, you send somebody something, they click on it, and there's code that's run in the background that just ends up pwning your phone, inserting the backdoor, maybe many backdoors, and then grabs data off the phone. So one of the things I find very interesting about privacy in the modern era is that the rich and powerful aren't immune from being surveilled by these groups. And in fact, there are very strong efforts by all kinds of different nation states, but certainly the United States, to keep tabs on the rich and powerful. One of the things that was found out through the Vault 7, Vault 8 disclosures is that there was a disproportional number of exploits for iPhones that the CIA was working on. And internationally, it's almost all Android phones. But in the United States, iPhones not only are pretty prolific and represent a significant percentage of the phones out there, but they also are very highly used by folks who have some sort of status or are in elite circles. So if you go to Yale University, almost everybody has an iPhone. And it's become such a strong part of that sort of East Coast, West Coast culture here that, that's the thing that people use. So the guess would be, well, they're trying to look at people who are powerful or might have extremely useful strategic information, or they can do things like you said, and basically try to make them into their puppet by spying on them and saying, hey, you probably wouldn't like if your dick pic went out there on the in normal internet. The fact that the Saudi Arabian prince is doing this is really crazy in one sense, but also that's the world we're in now. We're extremely networked. It doesn't take very much to create trust between two people, even if you're a Jeff Bezos. And obviously, the United States is always trying to court, rich and powerful in the United States are always trying to court Saudi Arabia and the elites there. So I guarantee you, Bezos never thought this was going to happen to him. What's scary, obviously, is that, Bezos should know better. Really, these people who are running these large, tech organizations should have extremely lockdown setups. They should have a good understanding of security, and they probably should have a small security staff that's with them, maybe not at all times, pretty often, who could have said, hey, maybe you shouldn't click on that, or hey, maybe WhatsApp is not the best thing you should be using on this phone. You should be using something else, right? And that would have kept Bezos from having this problem. Now, from a societal standpoint, the more I've been thinking about this, privacy is often a luxury for the rich and powerful, right? And as we keep going down the road we're going, the people who are poor and marginalized and so on are going to obviously not have the ability to extricate themselves from these surveillance systems to the degree that one can do so at all, right? But there is this deep state sort of component. There is this, what I used to call the watchers, right? There's a whole apparatus, which, Snowden talks about, of the national security state and these private contractors and these international, private groups that are also linked to other states and so on. And those groups have massive amounts of information on the rich and powerful, just like they have information on the poor. And I've never seen someone do a class analysis or put this in sociological terms, but I do think we're seeing some power shifts that are pretty interesting in that way. It's not just the what's considered the old traditional, okay, we've got the national security apparatus and it's extremely powerful. Now we've got this apparatus and they're getting really, really good at targeting people really, really well. And how can they pull the strings? They may be doing it in all kinds of ways that we're not even aware of, right? Who knows what's going on with Tim Cook or in how much he's being attacked, right? And by what players? There's just no way to know. So yeah, that's something I think about, and it's extremely interesting. And one more thing before I'm off. If you're interested in this sort of subject about the growth of this sort of national security apparatus and the connections to private entities and these contractors like Booz Allen Hamilton and so on, I suggest you look into Tyson's Corner, which is an area of Arlington, Virginia, or just a little outside Arlington, which is outside of Washington, D.C. It is growing huge, and it's already, has grown over the decades, but it's becoming a mega industrial tech center now. And Amazon is actually putting their new distribution center and their server apparatus there, that they bid for a long time. They were talking about putting it in New York and all these other places, but surprise, surprise, they put it in the center of the national security state in the United States, basically. So, check that out, read about it, go down there sometime and just look at it. There are powerful folks that we wouldn't traditionally call the intelligence community who are part of this apparatus. And, it's pretty scary. So.
Well, if that's all the time you have, Sean, I want to thank you so much for coming back on the Vigil again. We love it when you turn up, even when you're not in the hot dog costume. But don't let it stop you from donning it just because it's not Halloween. Sean, before you leave, please give the folks at home your final thoughts and let everyone know where they can and feel free to plug Privacy Safe and whatnot again.
Very cool. So just to return it back to the story that I wrote, I felt compelled to write it in the way I wrote it to highlight cases that I think are extremely poignant and some that we can take action on. They're all connected in some way. They all have sort of a cyber component to them. But the important one, which we talked about, Susie Dawson, that's something a lot of people don't know about. She needs help. She's done a very good job of documenting her case, and she just launched a new campaign to get support for her. If she's going to even get temporary asylum, it's going to be a long road. It's going to be a lot of fees, and she's been working on it now for 4 years and change, I think. So it's a big deal. The Chelsea Manning issue is huge. That tends to be talked about a little more than Assange, in my area of the world. The two things are very closely linked. We need to make sure that we remind people that they're the same thing, right? The reason Chelsea Manning is in jail is because she has enough solidarity and strength and so on not to, make up something just to get out of torture, which is what she's going through. And of course, Julian, we know quite well. I did like to see the German support that's been rising in the last couple of days for the petition there. So that article was on an outlet called The Privacy Issue, theprivacyissue.com. We'll be doing a lot more stories like that. We're going to be bringing on new writers, new voices, so it's not just me writing stuff. And we already have some excellent articles by another writer as well. We go into dragnet surveillance, tips to get around it. We talk about facial technology, even things like ultraviolet makeup and things like that you might want to do to try to get out of cameras spying on your face. So that's very cool. I also have this project called Privacy Safe, privacysafe.ai. That's where we're making those little mini computers I was talking about. We want to put those all over the place for all different use cases, but primarily for secure data storage and sharing. And I hope, telling you what's going on your network and whether your phone and your laptop and your smart devices are spying on you and by whom. So if you're interested in that, please go out to privacysafe.ai/survey2020. There's just one question, like I said, and if you want to keep in touch, give us your email address and we will reach out to you. When we start doing product testing and so on, that's going to be very useful.
Real quick, if I could ask something,
yeah.
We have protests planned in DC and events planned in London. How long would it take to ship the ultraviolet makeup? So that way we can have a way to counteract the surveillance systems that London just recently rolled out.
Yeah, that's a good question. Let me do some homework. The other thing you can do that's actually very powerful, but takes a little bit more engineering, and I'm thinking about just wearing one all the time on my glasses, is you can have a bright infrared LED so that your face just looks like a white spotlight, basically. And we're very successful in disabling cameras. Now, obviously, they were breaking infrastructure, and you may not want to go to prison. But they were doing a lot of things to obscure their face with masks and so on and so forth that were pretty successful. So let me do a little bit of research and see if I can come up with a couple strategies ahead of those two protests. I don't know about the ultraviolet makeup and the shipping on that. We'll source it and figure it out. I can ask my wonderful wife who knows a lot about all that stuff. So very cool. Yeah.
Thank you again for joining us, Sean.
Yep. And yeah, privacysafe.ai, the privacy issue. And of course, I'm at Yale, but that's easy to find. Yale Privacy Lab. We're still doing our digital self-defense workshops. Thank you so much.
I was muted. Both Mohammed Almazi and Sean O'Brien. Wow, that was a fantastic and educational little hour or so there. I really enjoy when Sean's on.
Yeah, I'm still slightly here. Thank you. I appreciate it. I'll try to do that more. I don't mean to run on you, but my life has been a little more wild than usual these past couple months. So.
Oh no, I mean, yeah, no, life happens, man. We're appreciative for whatever time you have, whenever you have it.
Great.
Yeah.
Awesome. I'll reach out with a couple of things. And yeah.
Right on.
Awesome. Have fun, guys.
Thank you, Josh. Or not Josh, Sean. I'm sorry.
That's not a problem. Bye.
Our tech guys, Josh. Thank you. I believe the last time he left in the chat, before he left, I said, thanks, Brian, because his last name is O'Brien. So I'm always calling him the wrong name. All right, guys, that was Sean O'Brien. He's a returning guest on our vigil, extremely intelligent, very knowledgeable on all things technology. So yeah, we thank him for coming on. Guys, as far as what we would like to get into next.
I think we went over most of our pre-planned stuff. I don't know what else we have hanging out.
Yeah, I would just say we haven't had any other donations to thank quite yet, but just to let people know that we do have 2 weeks left before, a little under 2 weeks left before we all start leaving for DC and London. And we do appreciate everybody's help in sharing the link and donating in these last couple weeks.
Yeah, again, like Christy was saying, donations, we're almost there. It's very helpful to us. Of course, this is not a very, it's not an easy trip to make. It's expensive, so it's so helpful. I guess do we have any last thoughts? Anything we want to touch on before we close out? No? Okay. Well, I want to thank everybody for watching and for supporting these causes, supporting Julian Assange and Chelsea Manning, whistleblowers and journalists and other political dissidents. Also, too, make sure that you follow the account Protect Susie. That's at Protect Susie. Make sure you sign that open letter, guys. Go to protectsusie.com/open letter. And then also, I would check out Susie's YouTube channel. It's Susie3D. There's a lot of really interesting content on there that you cannot find anywhere else. But more importantly, do sign that open letter. Again, that's protectsusie.com/open letter. My name is Taylor Hudak, and you can follow me on Twitter @_Taylor Hudak.
My name's Andrew Smith. You can find me on Twitter @Andrew Zigman. I just really want to give a special thank you to everyone just in all of our lives behind the scenes that help make these vigils possible, especially since we're stepping it up to trying to get out more regular live streams to produce more and higher quality content. So thank you to all those people that just help everything make this happen.
My name is Christy Doff. You can follow me on Twitter @Christy Doff, and I am also, in addition to being a co-host here, I'm also regularly contributing to D. Pierce SSC on YouTube, so please subscribe to his channel. We do Assange updates. We've been recently talking about the Iowa caucus, and we'll be commentating and discussing a lot of other topics coming up.
My name's Steve Poikinen. I host a show called Slow News Day, which you can find here on the YouTubes by typing in Slow News Day Podcast into the search bar. I'm on Twitter @Slow News Day Show. I do whatever I can to not use mainstream material for the baseline content that I then talk about on my show. I go as often as possible to independent outlets and independent journalists, and if I can, I will then bring them on the show and interview them tomorrow, 10 a.m. Pacific, 1 p.m. Eastern. I will be joined by Tariq Haddad. As Mohammed mentioned way earlier in the beginning of the vigil, Tariq is launching a couple of projects which will vastly expand independent media's ability to coordinate with each other, promote each other, and get the message out to a much broader audience, specifically an international one. So that's going to be a fantastic conversation. I hope you come join me for that. Thank you. Thank you to my co-hosts. Thank you to everyone who participated in the chat. Huge thanks to the people that donated. We literally can't do this without you. We can't. So it means a ton to just see this happen and come together. It's still kind of mind-blowing. Yeah, much love to you all, and until next time, good luck to us all.